Good morning, everyone. Can everyone hear me? All right. Okay. So this is a great turnout. This is excellent. We are very, very excited to get started. First of all, on behalf of the planning committee members, that includes Dr. Leandra Godoy, Stacy Hutchinson, Dr. Mian Ree, and our fearless admin, Kendra Nguyen, she is, she's like around here. So there she is. All right. So we've been working on this for a while, so I'm very glad to see so many wonderful faces, a lot of new faces, a lot of like stickers. That means a lot of people from outside children, which is great. And we are really excited to get started. So we have four wonderful presenters here today, and I'll go over and introduce them a little bit as we go along. But we really hope that you find today's talk exciting and educational. But regardless of our political beliefs, as pediatric providers, I think we all agree that these talks are not only going to be interesting and informational, but also these are urgently relevant. With everything that's going on in our border states with the separation of families, it is our duty and it's critical for us as providers to know and be informed about what's going on in the immigrant families and what are some factors that impact immigrant children's mental health and general well-being, and how we can help them thrive. So we have four wonderful experts on this, not that topic in general, but immigrant child mental health, and we're very fortunate to have them here with us today. Before we get started, though, a few housekeeping things. First of all, very special shout out to Dr. Randy Streisand, our Chief of Psychology, and also the Physician Diversity and Inclusion Program for their support, the Office of Nursing Education, Office of Medical Education, the National Association of Social Workers, and the National Register of Health Service Psychologists for making this event possible. We are very, very thankful for that. Okay, so a few other things, particularly regarding CE credits. So a lot of you want to get CE credits, right? So in your folders, we have the evaluation form. Please make sure that you fill them out. And for all of the CE credits, so we have 4 different types: CE credits for psychologists, for physicians, CNE credits, CNE for nurses, and also for social workers. For all 4, we need the evaluation forms completed, and you need to stay here all 3 hours. Do you not have them? Nope. We will give them to you. Yes. Okay. So we're going to be handing them out at the end of the break. Sorry about that. Okay, so special note for each of them, though. So again, you need to stay for the full 3 hours to get the CE credit, so make sure to do that, and also fill in the eval forms and send it back to us. For psychologists, the eval form will have a personal information section, and we do need you to fill that out for you to receive the appropriate credit. For social workers, please make sure that you sign in at the back, and the NASW will take care of the rest. Let's see, for CNEs, we do have a little disclosure slide. So about no conflict of interest for any of the planning committee members or the speakers, and we do have a small conflict of interest and or disclosure, which the speaker will talk about. No commercial support, and again, sign in, attend the program, and complete the evaluation for CNE credit. I do have the certificates already printed out with me. So for the nurses in attendance, just come to me and hand in the evaluation form at the end, and I'll give you the certificate. And for CMEs, we should have that information on there also in the folders. If we don't, we'll definitely send them out to you. For CMEs, for medical education, you can get the credit by logging on online at INOVA's website. And the information, the further information, the steps should be in the folder. All right? So now, let's welcome our first speaker, Dr. Noemí Enchautegui-de-Jesúsr. Oh, yes. And she hails from American University, and she's with her student, Aida Romero.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Good morning. It's so great to see all of you here today, where we can share with you what we've been doing in one of the projects we've been working on. Aida is no longer a student of mine. She graduated. She just graduated. All right. Let's start. Do we have today? That's the single slide. Our slide. All right, so we're talking a little bit about what was happening before young Central American immigrants came to the U.S. and what happened after they arrived. So to do that, we'll tell you about this project and also tell you about the impetus for doing this particular study. No disclosures or conflicts. Today, for those of you doing the continuing education, we have 2 learning objectives that we'll review again later. But let's go back in time a little bit in the time tunnel and think about 2015 and how the news were sharing that there was a surge in children coming to the southern border of the U.S. and they were coming unaccompanied. So we'll talk a little bit about what that means today, and Aida will tell us more about that. And so this was the impetus for this project that we'll describe today, thinking of all the children that were coming through the southern borders. There was going to be some kind of chaos going on, and what can we do about placing these children somewhere. And countries where these children were coming from at the time when the search was occurring was predominantly El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. About 71% of the children that were apprehended at the border during this period were from these 3 countries. And so the children in our study are from these 3 countries of origin as well. And the top receiving counties in the United States where the children were sent after being apprehended at the border, we have 3 of those counties right around us in the DMV area. So other counties in the top 10 are in Texas, or California, or New York. So we have 3 of them, which are Fairfax, Prince George's, and Montgomery. And children in our study, our youth in our project, are in those 3 locations as well. And I have a reference there in case you want to look into some more of the details that our colleagues at the Center for Latin American and Latino Studies have been working on and collected about those unaccompanied migrant children. And so this is a graph showing that surge. So you see the top bars there is that period between 2014, 2015, when many, many more children, thousands of them were coming to the southern border. Let me tell you about the project now. The project is called Household Context and School Integration of Federal Migrant Youth. This is a project that involves the collaboration between other colleagues that are Eric Herzberg, Ernesto Castañeda, and Dennis Finchcom and Aida Romero have been key and instrumental in collecting the data for this study. And so I'm going to let Aida tell us a little bit more about how they ended up collecting data.
Good morning again. Can you hear me well? Yes? No? Okay. There? Good. So recruiting for this study, as Noemí already explained, this was a project to really see, well, one, what were the country conditions of the unaccompanied children who were traveling to the United States. Then we wanted to see what was the migration process like. We also wanted to see who they were reuniting with. Were these children really coming to be just placed into a household, an American household, and not necessarily with a relative? And then we also wanted to study or investigate what school accommodations or, special counseling services or special school services have been created, if any, for this population, which is extremely large in the DMV area. Recruitment was really hard. We tried, I was speaking to someone before about DCC and who works here in DC. Recruitment in DC was really hard. We tried to do a lot of on-the-street recruitment, talking to people, handing out flyers, and people were just very wary. And this is way before the current administration took office. So they were already, but the elections had already taken place. So people were uncertain of what was going to happen. They weren't sure of what we were going to use data for, even though we had assured them that it was confidential, anonymous. It was just a one-time intervention, one-time interview, and that was it. But people were very wary of participating. They didn't want to give. We needed parental consent for interviewing the minors, and that was just not easy. So most of our recruitment was done through service providers. So service providers in the Montgomery and Prince George's County and Fairfax County areas where they already have a relationship established with the families we were able to interview. So that is important to keep in mind that there is some bias in our sampling because they are all receiving services from these service providers, and they had already established that trust with them. And that's why we were able to access them, thankfully. So we interviewed 58 immigrant youth, and they just varied between 8 and some are now older than 18. Some are, I think the oldest person we interviewed was 22, but they had all arrived when they were 18 or younger. So technically considered children. And we also interviewed their sponsors, who in most cases, and Noemí will talk about that in a bit, were one of the parents, in some cases both. And we have a very special case of a young boy who traveled unaccompanied when he was 10 to reunite with his grandmother, and she didn't know he was coming. So this was a total surprise. He came totally on his own, is doing fabulously in school. This is really a star participant, and I'll tell you a little bit about him later. But yeah, so most of the sponsors were parents. And then we also interviewed the school systems who allowed us to, local government representatives, and NGO staff interviews to hear different perspectives about how we're, how the counties are handling this population. Did you want to talk about that?
You can fill in.
Okay, so the youth interview, and this is also a further complication of recruitment, we had the sponsor interview and the youth interview, and ideally we did them at the same time, and in most cases we did. So while one of our team was interviewing the sponsor, another person was interviewing the child or youth. And the interviews were a bit long. The longest one lasted 2 hours and 15 minutes, but on average they were 1 hour and 15 minutes to 1 hour and a half. So we collected demographic data, who they live with in their country of origin, living conditions. We even inquired about, did you sleep in a bed? Did you share a bed? Did you, in some cases, they didn't sleep in a bed, they slept on a cot. What was the family dynamic like? Violence or threat exposure in country of origin, the motives for migrating. And these were varied, and Noemí will share the analysis of that. The journey to the U.S., the interaction with the U.S. immigration system. Right now it's been, I think, headlines in all of the news sites about the immigration system conditions that youth are placed in, but this has been happening for quite a while now. What is new is the separation of the children from the parents, and we'll talk a little about that too. The relationship with the sponsor who is here, school integration experiences, community engagement and and perceptions of community safety, which was also very important. We wanted to know how they felt here and how safe they feel here. And the feelings of safety are, different. The feelings of unsafety in their country of origin are due to gang violence or economic conditions, so, food insecurity and stuff like that, but mostly gang violence, especially for the young boys. And here, safety is more related to their immigration status, and that's the permanent fear of being deported. Then current household dynamics and family functioning with the sponsor family here, In many cases, we found the sponsor has a new family here. So in a lot of the cases, it was a mother who had married someone else here and had children who were born here. And so we wanted to see what are the dynamics like there. Are there any issues adapting to this new family setting? And then during the interview, we had two health questionnaires, the PHQ-8 and the trauma index to evaluate trauma symptoms. So we audio recorded. I think we had maybe 3 or 4 cases where the participants did not allow us to audio record them. But in most cases, they were audio recorded and then fully transcribed and then uploaded into a software to do the analysis. So here we have demographics.
All right. So earlier I mentioned that many of the children that were coming during that search came from 3 specific countries, most of them. And so this is the distribution in our sample. We have most of the kids in our study are from El Salvador. We also have kids from Honduras and Guatemala. They're mostly similarly divided between genders. We have 1 person who is non-binary. And then I wanted to emphasize the idea of what was the status at the border. So we started this project thinking that we would want to target specifically those children who came unaccompanied without a parent or an adult with them. But at the end, as Aida was describing, the recruitment was really tough to get the families. So we have a number of them, 27, that are going to be analyzed in this presentation today who are unaccompanied. They came through the southern border without a parent or without an adult responsible for them. But we also have other children in the study, and some of them, 11, as you can see, did come with a parent. And 9 of them were already documented. Some of those came through the plane and did not cross the southern border necessarily. And then we had 3 people who came as adult arrivals. So the age of migration, which you see on the left, the mean age of migration was 14 years of age. So we have a range from 8, the youngest person came at 8, and the oldest person came when they were 20. But when they were interviewed, for some of them it had been already 2 years, for some of them it had been only a few months. One of the interviewees was a month here only of arrival. So let's talk a little bit about the journey and what happens when they cross the border before we start talking specifically about some of the well-being outcomes that we wanted to share with you today. And so one of the things that we can share, and Aida, you have to collaborate on this part with me, is with whom are they traveling and how are they traveling here. And so most of the kids in this particular project were coming by land, because they were unaccompanied or they're not documented. And that particular part of the experience is the part in which we expect to see the most difficulties, the biggest challenges. We're talking about people crossing through different countries, multiple countries. This is not just around the border. They have had to come from the south. So maybe you can tell them some of the things that you've heard about the actual journey, the different segments, and how Mexico becomes the one in which they are more worried about.
Certainly. So most of the youth, obviously the documented youth were sent for by their parents, but most of the youth in our sample were traveling with what are called coyotes, so people who charge for bringing the children here to the United States. And the prices they pay vary, but it's probably, I think, an average of $3,500 per child, and that includes 3 tries. So I was amazed to hear this, but that price includes if you are caught in any part of the journey and deported back to your home country, they will pick you up again and bring you back. However, there are several cases where they were taken advantage of by the coyotes. There was a case of 2 siblings who were traveling together, both underage, and they were held hostage by the coyotes, demanding more money from the parents who had absolutely no more money to give. And so there are these processes of loans and mortgaging properties in their home country to get the money to be able to free their children from these kidnappings. That was not the that was not the most frequent case, but it did happen.
And we had one case where the charge was extreme. It was $8,000, plus then $2,000 more because something went wrong somewhere else, and then they wanted the parent to scratch $2,000 more and add that to the price.
So it's quite a criminal enterprise because the coyotes are paying Guatemalan or Salvadoran law enforcement, Mexican law enforcement to let them through. And there are, there are marked vans, which they know, and anyway, all sorts of terrible things. In the past year, in the past 6 months of last year, Mexican authorities really ramped up their immigration. I don't know how to say this, but it was much more difficult for the people who were traveling, particularly in groups. So they were traveling on buses to make their way through Mexico and not be detected. We had the case of a mother who was traveling with her 11-year-old son, and they were caught twice by Mexican immigration authorities. Once were stoned. When they were trying to run away, they were stoned by the immigration authorities in Mexico to slow them down, and the child fell, so she had to stop, and they were deported. But, on the third try, she made it here. So there's a lot of time and money, and it's a very dangerous journey. We do have some stories of children who were picked up in a private vehicle and changed from private vehicle to private vehicle and made it all the way here unscathed and safe. But that was sadly not the case. Not typical of most cases.
And some of them come in these trucks full of people just standing for a very long period as they're transported. Everybody standing in this in the back of this truck, like cargo, I guess you can call them, freight trucks, with no opportunity really to eat or to use the bathroom or anything like that. So some of the things they describe about what made it so hard is this kind of experiences that they had. And then the fear of deportation is one of the things that they have hanging over them as they're traveling, because as Aida was saying, at any point during these different transitions to countries, they could be deported back to back home. So it's not the deportation at the U.S. border, it's in the other points as well, and all the extortion and the environment. Once they're closer to the border of the U.S., then they're talking about desert areas, crossing the river, so all the fears that come for those inhospitable environments. But I wanted to also share with you these different places that they get to once they make it to the border. We talk about the idea of unaccompanied minors. So when a person is unaccompanied and is a minor from those three countries we mentioned before, the United States have a specific policy to deal with them that is different from what they will do if the child is from Mexico, let's say. But if the child is from these different countries, then the United States have a policy to process them, not to send them back immediately. And so this is an area in which you probably have heard in the news when kids talk about where they were placed when this happened. And so the terms that are used by the Spanish-speaking community is the perrera, la hielera, and then the albergue. So I wanted to have Aida describe these three different detention places for you.
So when they reach the border, what we would do would be to place them on a makeshift raft, cross the river, and then tell them, keep walking, and immigration will find you. And that was the case in the majority of the participants. So they turned themselves in to immigration officials here, and then they are placed, the first cell they are placed in is what they call the hielera, like an ice box, because it's extremely cold. And young children were not in our sample separated from their mothers, but boys older than 5 would be sent to another hielera next door to their mothers. They have a toilet, and just a toilet in the cell, and they're held there until they're interviewed, and then they were sent to the perrera, which is which has been in the news, and they call it that because it kind of seems like a cage that you use to, house dogs. So they would call it a perrera. All of our participants passed through this, except the ones who flew into the country. So it's not a new thing. And then after being in the perrera, with, the foil sheets and the very thin mattresses, they would be sent to the albergue. And we have very, very good accounts of the albergue in which the children feel very comfortable there. They were bathed, they were given clothes, they were given food, they had to attend classes, they play games. There were a few instances of where they were not so happy, but we have a case of a mother traveling with 2 children who was given a room by herself to be with her 2 children, and this was, of course, before, right? This people who arrived before last year. But overall, the shelter seems to be, from our participant sample, seemed to be a good place for the people to be waiting until they could be reunited with their sponsors. And sometimes that reunification period took a little longer because the sponsor has to pay the trip for the either a family unit or the minor to come to them. And some could afford the plane, some could only afford buses. But that seemed to be the major holdup.
Thank you. And when Aida was describing this foil, this is all they got to cover themselves. There's nothing else, no beds or mattresses, anything like that. This floor, and very little food, just a sandwich or juice. So it's really dire at the Herrera and Allegra. Now we're going to start talking more about some of the well-being indicators for our sample. And so the first learning outcome is to sort of hear what is the well-being like before and after, and then we'll talk about the second learning outcome later. And so we are talking about 3 things that we use in our study. We're asking the kids to describe health problems they had before they left and health problems they have now. We have a measure of depression indicators for the past 2 weeks or in the past year, and trauma indicators for the past 2 weeks. And so for this, I'm going to start by describing just numerically what we saw. And what we saw is that a certain percentage of kids would say, yes, I had this problem before I left, right? So they would have constant stress, they would have anxiety, they would have sadness, they would have mental health as they might have conceived of, because the question was, do you have any kind of mental health problems? And then medical problems. And then asked about, do you have any of those problems now that you live here? And so what I have at the end here in the table is this idea of, are they worse off now, or are they better now? And that means that some kids would say, I didn't have this problem before, now I have it. And the opposite, I had a problem before and now I don't have it. And so with mental health in particular, the kids that had mental health problems before, none of them now have any mental health problems, the way that they are perceiving mental health problems. But they do have, still, you would see that they have constant stress. There would be kids that have anxiety and sadness, and some health problems. So that's still happening with this sample after. It's not exactly the same kids. That's why some of them are better off, some of them are worse off, because new problems arise. And so now other kids are being affected and feeling bad. So let's talk about some of those things. What are some of the things that make people feel constant stress or anxiety or sadness or other issues? And so before they came, some of the things they would describe, these are examples to give you an idea of what they're talking about. So what is it that gives them stress when they were in their home country? The idea that a parent was not with them, and we'll talk in a moment about what are those conditions that would make them say that the parent is somebody that is giving them stress because they miss them. The gangs, the being alone, or thinking about eventually coming to the U.S., all of those things were giving them stress. Anxiety at the time that they were in their home country was related to thinking of the future, what would the trip be like, being aware of the violence that was impacting their friends, the gangs in the area, the fact that a parent was not there and they needed that parent, lack of money to afford things they needed for school, for example, or the fact that there's so much crime and delinquency that they cannot really focus on things they want to do, like studying, or having to pay gangs or pay coyotes. And Aida described the coyotes as those people who smuggle individuals to another country. Oh. And then the sadness, and we'll see in a moment what are some of the situations that are producing the sadness also, but the idea that they are going to be leaving people behind that they care for was creating this kind of sadness, thinking of these parents that they're thinking they'll meet, because they now know that they're coming, and so the sadness of not knowing that parents or that some person that took care of them, like grandmothers, which we'll see also in a moment, is very prevalent, having a grandmother taking care of them. So the passing of that grandparent, all of those were things that were causing sadness. And as you see there too, also the death or disappearance of friends, which is part of that environmental violence that we hear about. And then once they are here in the U.S., the kinds of things that cause stress, anxiety, and sadness include in the U.S. being indoors all the time. For them, it's not something that they are used to. The fact that they may have to work, anxiety because of policies or the political environment, thinking of what they're going to be doing with their future, the bullying that is taking place, separation that has happened with the family. They have left some people behind that they left, that they lost. So all of that is causing sadness. In terms of the health indicators, we said earlier that some people had some health problems. Some of those health problems continue later, and that includes asthma, gastritis. Some of the kids that were not having health problems before, physical health problems, and have them now, some of them have to do with a lot of stomach or abdominal issues, like abdominal pain, gastritis, and so which could be related to both, they say, is the food, they're having problems getting used to the food here, but it could also be related to mental health issues and the ways that stress can also affect your functioning in that area. All right, so let's talk first about the indicator of well-being depression and how it's measured was with the patient health care questionnaire, which was adapted to these younger samples, or younger people, I'm sorry. And what we see is that in this particular sample, none of them seem to have scores in the range of being moderate or severely depressed or having moderate or severe depression. These are measures just to give you a sort of an indication, suggestion that there may be something you need to follow up on. But possible mild depression, yes, there were some scores that may suggest there would be something like that. 12% of the sample, this particular sample, scored on that. And when asked about whether you felt sad or depressed most days in the past year, 38% said they did feel this way in the past year. And 36% that said that these problems of thinking of all these things that were mentioned regarding the depression items were things that were causing them difficulty to concentrate either at home or at work, or the kinds of things they have to do due to this problem. So there is a sizable proportion. We're talking about almost, a little bit over a third of the population that is impacted in this way by this problem, and they are here now and trying to adjust and integrate into the U.S. and their life here, but having these mental health issues hovering.
I just wanted to add a note there.
Yes.
That we had participants who would say not at all to most of the questionnaire. And then the two last questions, if they felt depressed or sad most days in the past year, they would say yes. So even though the questionnaire has been adapted to, Spanish-speaking population, and this is only my perception, this is not scientific, but I'm not sure that they were totally comprehending what was being asked or really able to acknowledge that within themselves. So I just wanted to note that because it was confusing, and especially after hearing all of their life story, and then it didn't mesh well with the answers they were given. So we thought that there was some lack of understanding or maybe insight as to how they feel. Or perhaps they are so used to feeling in a certain way that they cannot recognize that this is salient or that this is an issue of depression. It's not just the way that things are.
Mm-hmm. And so you see the difference here in between the scores shown in the top and the bottom is the 2 weeks and multiple items such as that. And then the next questions are about 1 year and in the past year have you felt sad most of the time. So regarding trauma, so what we administer with Part B, which is the one that asks how often these problems have bothered you, the problems that we've been talking about in the past 2 weeks. And there were 17 items included here. And some of the examples are there, things that are more or less tapping into PTSD. And the score suggests that this sample has about 28% of the kids or the youth in this sample with possible PTSD. Again, this is not you know, a clinical assessment. This is a way to sort of screen and suggest things that we need to follow up, or people like yourself who may be serving this community could follow up on. And so there may be possibilities of PTSD in about a quarter of the sample, and 14% of them may be possible moderate trauma-related distress. And so I wanted you to see if you could share with them some of the things that you saw during the interviews that could be some of the trauma things that they were describing here.
Sure. So in some cases, in one particular case, the most traumatic event that they recalled was witnessing the assassination of a friend of theirs by a gang member. 5 participants had witnessed a murder, but this person had witnessed the assassination of their friend. So exposure to violence was something common, not necessarily all assassinations, but it was something common. However, the majority of participants, when recalling the most traumatic event, was the moment when they had to say goodbye to their primary caretaker in their country of origin. And this was usually their grandparents. So even in the case of one participant who had witnessed a murder in the street and then they all ran away and hid, he recalled as the most traumatic event in his life when he said goodbye to his grandmother. So I found that particularly striking. And so in general, they would say that the separation from their family member in their country of origin was very hard. And then for some lesser number was the realization when arriving here that the parents that they had sort of idealized this idea of a mother and the life they were going to lead here was not necessarily the reality. But that was a minority in the sample.
Mm-hmm. And so what we are going to look at now is some of those situations that were happening at their country of origin, so we can have a context to these well-being indicators. So that's the second learning outcome for us today, is to think of the context of family and community in both the country of origin and in the U.S. And so, first of all, what were the reasons why they left their country of origin? And they could give multiple reasons, but I wanted to show you what were some of the common things presented. And this idea of crime and violence, right, and lack of safety was primary. They also, of course, when you're talking about immigration, people had in mind the idea of pursuing opportunities and a better life, so that was also a common answer. Mm-hmm. And then family reunification, so coming here so they can meet up with the person, the parent usually that they were separated from. And in the next slide, I'll show you the proportion of people who had been separated from parents for years. And then the experiences, as Aida was mentioning, they have seen somebody die. And so what are some of these experiences of exposure to gang activity? So 44% of people in our sample felt threatened when they were in their home country with this gang activity. 80% of them said they had gang presence in their community or knew people, acquaintances who were involved. And 30% of them were asked to join a gang, and 6% felt that they had to join. The reasons for joining were varied for feeling that pressure that they had to join. And some of those reasons included things like feeling like out of place and not really connected. So we've heard the same story sometimes in the U.S. about how people join gangs. And then the food insecurity in the sample, about 28% of them said they experienced food insecurity back in their home country. So let's talk now a little bit about those household situations, the family, who's there, who's not. And one of the things I want to call your attention to is the percent of them who have a parent who's away. So they're growing up without this person in their life, right? So these are transnational families. So 54% of them had a father in the U.S. while they were in their home country. 46% had their mothers in the U.S. when they were in their home country. And then 20% of them had both parents. And I'm getting my numbers here confused as to how the multiple parents are. So they can have all these different people there. So I wanted to show you on the table on the right is when this parent left, right? And some of them had never seen these parents to this day. So they're now being interviewed, but some of them had never seen their father or their mother. So they may be living with somebody else. 14 people in our sample, so these are not percentages, these are the actual numbers out of 50, last saw their mothers when they were infants or toddlers. And so now that we're interviewing them, and they are, I told you that they were about 16 years of age as an average during the interview, so they haven't seen the mother since they were infants. And then later, so that would be like 6 or 5 years of age up to adolescence. So that's when many of them also last saw a parent. And then some of them had not seen them since infancy or toddlerhood, but now have been reunited with this person, which is what Aida was describing, how this reunification is happening now. So when you say see them now, that includes both people who are now reunited and people who've never separated and traveled with a parent, and so they're together now. So in terms of those family dynamics, many of them said they're getting along well, but we do know that they also have these reunification challenges, and I think Rachel is going to talk about some of these things later. So they described some of these things also in our study about what are some of the difficulties reuniting back with family that they haven't seen in many years, siblings that they didn't even know. And in many cases, like you said, Aida, right, they have a new member of the family, like a step-parent or a new spouse that is causing difficulties. One of the ones that I found very moving was a child, a young person who described how they now see this mother with this man. This man is their father that they have been reunited with. So the mother they were with, and they travel with the mother, and then they're in the U.S. to be reunited with the father. But the fact that there is this man in her life is throwing him off, this particular participant.
He's very possessive.
Yeah, so he's like with her and in her bed, and who is this person? And so it's taken a while to get used to this new unit in the house. So I don't know if you have other unification stories that you would like to share.
Well, as you said, I'm sure Rachel will share many, but the best cases were those where the child was reunifying with just one parent who had no other family here and could, in that way, devote more time to getting to know each other. Then we also, again, because most of our participants were receiving services from different service providers, they had attended workshops that are strictly meant for family reunification dynamics, where they teach both parents and children to really listen to each other and understand where their feelings are coming from. So that really helps. But it was particularly sad to see that in households where there are American-born children, so the parent has a new spouse here and has American children, there are definitely power plays between the children, and the American-born children make fun of their newly arrived half-sibling because of language and many other issues. In some cases, the parents themselves, the parent and actual parent, biological parent, consider the citizen children, the American citizen children, as of higher value and will actually manifest that. So you can imagine the dynamics within the family. That was particularly sad. And yeah, so the majority said that the relationship was going well. But again, we don't know, that's their answer. And we have to trust their answer, but there were definitely many issues that we could see. And we had one case of a child who is just waiting to turn 18 to run away from her house and would express it like that. And then we had another case of a young lady who was having severe emotional challenges and felt very unwelcome and also very resentful towards her stepfather, even though he had granted her documentation. Like he had, through him, she had obtained her green card.
So I just referred to this mixed status family, when you have members of the family who have citizenship or have documentation versus other members who do not have it. So you have this mixed status family. So in this slide, what we have is other information saying that they're going through other typical accultural distressors that other immigrants experience, things related to language and dealing with the new environment, the weather, the clothes that you have to wear for that, and navigating settings like school,
the bus ride.
So all of these things are challenges for any new immigrant. But most of the kids in this particular study feel that their quality of life has improved and they do want to stay in the U.S., although some of them do want to go back because they still have those loved ones that they left behind and because it's been very hard for them to navigate or deal with these acculturative stressors. And so in the U.S., in terms of some of the things that you would expect from adolescents, what is going on with them, and so these are different settings or contexts for development in adolescence. So we have schools, and most of them are in schools, but at the time of our interviews, several of them were not attending, had decided not to attend anymore, some of them because of other pressing demands, such as having to work. Some of them needed to be employed or have a job of some kind. In terms of adjusting in school, they are feeling that they're okay and good, but there's a lot of confusion, and this is where a role for school officials is important to sort of understand how to assist new incoming young people in their schools, because they're very confused, especially when they don't understand the language and they don't know what this is in this classroom and these periods and any of the ways that school systems work. I wanted to mention peers and teachers as different parts of this context because for adolescent development, we know how important these peer relationships are, and 2/3 of our youth in our sample say they do have a close friendship, but the other side of that is that there's a third of them that don't have a friend of the kind. Even though they say they're making friends, they're making new friends in this new environment, the fact that they don't have that could be detrimental for their adolescent development, having a lack of that kind of relationship. And then half of the youth said that their teachers, that they had at least one teacher who cares and listens, but then what happens to the other half? And so all of these are like points of possible interventions that we can think about. Oh, I didn't mention the employment. So 1/3 of them are employed, mostly in the food service sector, which you probably have even encountered yourself, people working in McDonald's or a restaurant or pizzeria. And a few of them only were working in other things like cleaning and construction. And in terms of extracurriculars, most of them refer to sporting things like soccer or other sports. But 13 of them were not involved at all. And again, we think of what are some of the ways in which we can have typical experiences for development for adolescents by providing the range of opportunities for them beyond sports for extracurricular activities. So how many minutes? Okay, so we want to end trying to talk a little bit about other things that are happening in the U.S. and how that provides a context to understand how they're doing here. And so one of the things we asked them, and Aida, you referred to this earlier, what is it that makes them feel safe and what makes them feel unsafe in the U.S.? And on the left here, you see what is making them feel safe is having the family with them. So they would say specifically the fact that my father is there or my mother is there or that they're all together or this unit is together. So that in itself is providing that sense of safety. or the fact that you can be inside your home and close your door, close your windows, and feel that that's your safe space. Many of them cite that they live in a low crime area, or there's one of the words that is used a lot is that it's very peaceful around where they are. But they also like that there's a lot of patrols surveilling and going around, and that gives them a sense of safety, different from they described from their country of origin, where that necessarily did not give them a sense of confidence of being safe. And so here they're feeling that way. And the last thing that I wanted to highlight from that side is the idea of that sense of unity. Somehow they're feeling, and maybe this is around the time, like Aisha described, people were feeling united around the political climate. They felt that there was a sense of unity and goodwill among the people around where they were, and that was also giving them a sense of safety. But what made them feel unsafe, although only 24% of them say they feel safe, so this is a very positive kind of outlook in the sample. A lot of things that we would ask, they would tend to say, I feel good, they get along well, I'm adjusting well. So here is another one in which, no, they feel very secure. And when they didn't feel secure or safe was because of immigration. So either fear that immigration will come knocking, fear of seeing, because now they have been able to recognize what that looks like when immigration is coming around, and also the immigration policies and what they do we're hearing on the news. Another thing that seemed to make some people fearful, again, this is a smaller percentage. I said it's 24% that felt insecure, and only about 4% mentioned this race issue. But these are usually people who live in areas, and you remember we talked about Prince George's County, Montgomery County, and Fairfax County. And so some of these kids are now in environments in which they were not used to being among other people of other races. And so that is creating some tension and apprehension on how to do with that, especially because a couple of them did experience some encounters with people of other races in which there was some beatings. One of them was beat up by some of these kids. And so that creates, for some of them, this tension. But it's part of the not being necessarily used to that environment. And then the criminal activity, because they do hear about some of the criminal activity that may be happening, and so being mugged or knowing about somebody being mugged or burglaries in the area created insecurity. So the last thing about prejudice and discrimination. So they were asked, do you feel you're treated fairly? Do people bother you because of your race, skin color, where you're from? And yes, that happens. It's no surprise that this happens. And when it happens by people in places that you would suspect, so school officials or people in restaurants. Remember, some of them had jobs in restaurants, so they would encounter that. They seem particularly saddened by the fact that other Latinos or Latinas would do this to them, or that people of color would do this to them. And so that was, it seemed that particularly disheartening when it happened. I think, Aida, you described even in the family, it could happen within the same family. So they would be excluded or feel that they were bullied, and people would tell them things like, return to your country. So these are the typical things we may hear. So it's happening also to our very young people. And when they are asked if they're treated fairly, again, because this is very positive kind of thinking people, they said that they are treated fairly, but they did have examples of when that is not the case, and that involves the shouting, the insults, and the bullying.
And one little anecdote, they're very short. In schools, youth who had previously been newcomers but now have been here for a while are calling the newcomer youth chanchitos or piggies. And so it's perpetuating the bullying cycle, right? The newcomers who have, who have arrived and are bullied by people who were born here of Hispanic descent because they feel superior, and other groups as well. And then when they have a more vulnerable student coming in, so a newly arrived student, then they perpetuate the bullying cycle. They do what has been done to them. And so, yes.
To conclude, what we wanted to remind us of is not only of the context that we just described, but just the fact that they do have those adverse experiences at their home country during the travel, and then here they may have some other adverse experiences. So we're aware of them. But at the same time, we have to acknowledge that there may be other ways in which there may be strengths developed, things that we can foster as support for them so that we can facilitate their adjustment, which is in the right track when we see some of the things they share, that despite all those things that happen, that they could say, oh, I'm doing well, it's okay. It means that there are some things that are being provided for them that could also assist with their strengths and support. Anything else that you can add to?
No, well, we forgot to put in our contact information, but I was wondering if through the hospital we could give it out. Thank you. This project has been marvelous to be a part of, and thank you all for your interest in the immigrant mental health and the immigrant community and the mental health. And any questions?
Actually, we're going to, in the interest of time, we're going to do Q&A at the end.
Okay.
So if you could just, if you have any burning questions, just jot them down so you don't forget, and we're going to address them at the end. All right?
Thank you. Okay.
All right, that was an incredibly informative session. That was really wonderful, and we really want to thank you guys for giving us all that information. And it actually sets up the next talk very well. So we have Rachel Osborn coming in from Mary Center here in DC, and she's going to talk about some clinical considerations. Thank you.
That top one.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah.
I'm a little shorter than, can you hear me? Yes, okay. Good morning. Buenos dias. My name is Rachel Osborn. I am here with Mary Center. I'm a senior clinical manager with our school-based mental health programming, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about considerations when we're working with immigrant youth and families in a clinical context. So as a therapist, psychologist, social worker, nurse, doctor, or in any other capacity that some of you in this room might be connecting with immigrant youth and their families. Just by a show of hands, who in the room is familiar with Mary Center and the work we do? Okay, great. Does anyone work at Mary Center? You did. You just started. So just to give a little bit of I have no relevant disclosures or conflicts of interest. Learning objectives, my hope is that as a result of this, regardless of experience or training you've had to date or regardless of your roles, you'll feel like you have a little bit better understanding of the unique context of our immigrant youth in DC, feel increased confidence in assessing the clinical impact of immigration in your work or in your role, whatever that might be, and then consider ways that you and your role can help foster resiliency among immigrant youth and families in your setting. So just a bit of background, since we're talking about context, a little bit of background on the context in which we're working with families at Mary Center. We're a federally qualified health center, an FQHC, which means we receive federal funding along with a mandate to serve the city's most vulnerable, marginalized residents, subsets of the population that have traditionally been shut out of the healthcare system because of income, because of geographic location, because of family status, because of documentation status. So we provide services in a lot of areas. I won't go through all of them, but they all fall within one of our 3 areas of programming: health, education, and social services, because we believe that it's when families have access to all 3 of these areas, regardless if they're within our agency or outside of Mary Center, that they can be in their optimal place, not just to survive, but to thrive. And our school-based mental health program is essentially that. We provide mental health services in schools. We're a relatively new program. We just finished our 5th school year, and I want to start by explaining a little bit about how our program came about, which is that we realized there was a disparity in who was able to access our services, our outpatient services at our clinic. We would get referrals for, mostly for kids and teens from schools, from maybe some of you in this room, and families would come and they would go through the therapy intake process, and then they would slowly start to miss maybe every other appointment, or in a lot of cases never even made it through the door, never even made it to intake. And we wanted to know why, and all of us in this room probably have an idea of why. We know that families face major barriers like transportation and childcare and language access and time. Time is a resource that not all families have equal access to. But we wanted to at least try to figure out how could we eliminate that geographic access barrier, families getting to the clinic every week. So we figured rather than waiting for the community to come access the service, let's at least try to eliminate that barrier and place therapists directly inside of schools where families are already spending time every day. Last year we served a little bit over 1,000 clients in 18 school sites. We'll be in 20 next year, mostly in wards 1, 4, and 5, which are sort of centered around where we have our clinics. So I'm a therapist, so obviously I'm going to start us with a little guided imagery exercise. I invite you to get comfortable. We will be here for a moment. Maybe place your feet flat on the ground. You're certainly welcome to close your eyes if that helps. And let's say that you're 6 years old, and you live in a small village outside of a larger city in, we'll say, Honduras. You have 2 younger siblings, your mom, your grandparents. Your father is no longer in your life for whatever reason. There are a lot of things you love about your life. You love that you get to help your grandparents take care of the crops and cattle. It makes you feel smart, makes you feel competent and important. You love that everyone in your town seems to know and look out for each other. When something good happens, everyone celebrates. When something bad happens, everyone comes together. But life is also really hard, and the older you get, the more you realize this. You see your mom less and less because she is always working, and she seems so worried all the time. And she admits she's not sure if she'll be able to keep paying for your school books and uniform next year. And at some point, you realize she has to pay these large sums of money to gang members simply to own her tiny business in town selling shoes and clothes. And she starts to talk to you about gangs and what you should do if they start to pressure you to join, or if they start to harass you on your way to and from school. And you start hearing from kids at school about other things about gangs, things that have happened to their families, or maybe to them. And then you start hearing about this magical place called USA. And in USA, everyone's rich. People hang out at the mall, and they drive new cars, and they have the newest cell phones. In USA, everyone lives in mansions. You have your own swimming pool, and you have your own bedroom. And in USA, you get to study, not just for 4 or 5 hours a day, but for the whole day. And you can learn English, which is what your mom tells you is what will help you get ahead. In USA, people feel safe. People don't have to pay in order to work. People don't walk looking over their shoulders. People feel protected by police officers. In USA, life is good. And then one day, mom sits you down as the oldest child and tells you she's going to move to USA. She's going to get there as quickly as she can. She's going to find a big house and get a great job and then bring you and your siblings over as soon as she can. And in your 7 or 8-year-old brain, that's soon. That's going to happen quick, maybe a couple weeks, maybe a couple months. And it is so painful to hug her and say goodbye, but you know it means that things are going to get better for you and your family soon. And you feel lucky because you've had friends at school whose parents went to USA, but they never got to say goodbye. The parent just left, probably because it was too hard. And a few weeks go by until you hear from mom, but finally she calls to say that she made it. She's in this beautiful city called Washington, D.C., the capital of USA. She's living in this amazing neighborhood called Petworth, Fort Dutton. And at first you talk every day, and then slowly this becomes maybe every couple of days or once a week. Because mom didn't realize how expensive Wi-Fi and data plans were going to be in USA, and you hadn't realized that you don't always get a signal in your village, especially when it rains a lot. And at some point, mom tells you she's got a new partner. And then at some point, mom tells you that you're going to have a new little sister. And you know you're supposed to feel excited because she sounds excited, but it's strange because you don't feel anything at all. And at some point, you start to develop a new normal, where you share your report card with your grandma instead of mom. And when something bad happens, you cry with your grandma instead of mom. Maybe you start calling your grandma mom. And things continue on like this until something really bad happens. Your grandmother, the person who you've come to see as your mother, passes away. Your grandfather is too frail to take care of 3 young kids, so suddenly your mom is calling and saying, it's time, pack your bags. And suddenly you find yourself on a 22-day journey through deserts and mountains and rivers and on buses, and you are in charge of your 2 younger siblings despite only being 13 yourself. You find yourself dividing meals that are barely enough for 1 person into 3 parts to make sure that you all get to eat. You find yourself having to muffle or sometimes even lightly hit your younger brother in the middle of the night to keep him from crying loudly, which could put your whole group at risk. You find yourself not being able to sleep because you feel like your heart is always racing and you're always looking over your shoulder and your body aches because it's so tight and clenched. And then suddenly you arrive at the border of USA, and luckily you're all still together, and it is chaos. And everything happens really fast, and you've heard people talk about this place called the hielera, which literally means icebox or freezer, but you don't understand really why it's called that until you are there and you spend a day in the coldest room you've ever been in, and you're fed a cold sandwich, and you are huddled together under this thin plastic blanket with your siblings. And then you're told you're leaving. You think to go home, but instead you're taking to shelter in Arizona. Arizona? Mom's in Washington. And then after another couple weeks there, you're told you're finally going to get to see Mom. And the day comes, and you remember what she looked like, and she was so young and beautiful and energetic. And it's only been 5 years, but she looks so much older. She has some wrinkles, maybe a little gray hair. She looks really tired. And there's a man there who you don't recognize and a small child holding her hand, and at that moment, you finally understand what it means that you have a new little sister. And you arrive to home to find you don't live in a mansion at all, but a tiny apartment with poor ventilation, no swimming pool. You definitely don't have your own room. Mom doesn't have a car. She can't drive. And you can't really run around and play freely outside because Mom says that traffic on Georgia Avenue is really dangerous, that there's a lot of crime, and that you at your age have to be especially careful about gang recruitment, and at which point you realize you didn't leave that problem behind you in Honduras at all. And then it's the first week of 9th grade, and your school is huge, and you've got the most complicated A-Day, B-Day, bell schedule you've ever heard of, and your teachers are talking to you about access testing and park testing and AP testing and community service hours and locker combination, and yet all the while you even haven't had a moment to process that your grandmother, the person who's been caring for you for all these years, is gone. You haven't had a chance to mourn. And you notice that even though you're no longer on that dangerous journey, you sometimes still have trouble sleeping. Your heart still races. Your body still feels clenched and tight. You're always a little jumpy. And you realize that nobody, not even your teachers or not even your mom, really know all the things you're carrying around with you in your backpack. So I'll stop there. We could keep going. But I just want to hear, call it out. What, for you, as that child, what do you feel? What is it like to be you? Scared? Confused? Yeah, disoriented? Anything else? Sad? Devastated? Yeah. So I wanted to share this image. It's from a curriculum that's called Families Reunite that I'll have a link to at the end, that was developed by Fairfax County Public Schools, which is a beautiful program. And they, just like us, do a lot of work with kids and with families, of helping them unpack what can sometimes be a really wide gap between their expectations, their dreams, what they imagined, and their reality, what their actual experience has been. And this is in Spanish, but some of them, what did I imagine? A big school, pretty clothes, go to New York, be happy with our parents. My experience, sadness, boredom, ugly clothes, normal house, I don't know New York. So before I go any further, I want to make 2 sort of disclaimers. One is that this is a panel on working with immigrant youth. I'm focusing primarily on youth from Central America because that's primarily who comes through our doors at Mary Center. But I want to acknowledge we have a very diverse immigrant community in DC and in our DC schools, and this is by no means meant to exclude those voices. And the second thing is that we hear a lot about the immigrant story or the immigrant experience or the immigrant dream, and that's a myth. There's no such thing. Again, by show of hands, how many of you are either an immigrant yourself or the child of immigrant parents? Myself included, none of us had the same experience, which is why we're going to be talking about how do we understand the context in which somebody immigrated here and understand the impact of it on that child. It's largely based, what I'm presenting is largely based on patterns and themes that have emerged in our work over the last couple of years. Some of it's heavy, it's not meant to sensationalize, it's just the reality of what a lot of our kids are living with, and there's also a lot of resilience and hope and strength in their stories too. So I want to make sure that we have time for that. So common trends, who is a typical kid that's going to get referred to us in the school from Central America, mostly what's called the Northern Triangle of Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador. They've had a major attachment rupture in childhood, which means that we know that children develop optimally when they are in the consistent presence of a stable caregiver, ideally, but not necessarily a biological parent. When something gets in the way of that, whether because that parent leaves or they get sick or they pass away, that's what we call a form of attachment trauma, and we should be seeing it as such. Families immigrate for economic or physical survival. Most of our kids have lived with a kinship caregiver, maybe an aunt or uncle, a grandparent, a family friend, a neighbor, in some cases an older sibling that was barely an adult themselves, entered the U.S. via land border or land crossing, have been reunited with a primary caregiver in the U.S. or placed in the care of a non-parental sponsor, again, aunt, uncle, grandparent, family friend. We've had a couple of cases this year of kids of 12, 13-year-olds who were placed in the care of their sponsor who was their 18-year-old sibling, who was barely an adult themselves. And then English is their second or in some cases third languages. We have kids whose native language is an indigenous language. They then had to learn Spanish second and then are learning English third. And then what's not on here, but a lot of our kids have had what we call interrupted education. So there was a period of time where they were not in school at all, either because they had to work or it was no longer safe or they couldn't afford it. And in a lot of our DC schools, we'll see kids who are then placed at a much lower level than their grade or their age because of their interrupted education or because of their English level. So we'll have a 17-year-old who's in 9th grade and is 3 or 4 years older than everyone else in our cohort, which is really stressful. So I thought the best way to talk about, share how we assess the clinical impact of immigration on clients is just to share some of the questions that we ask. Some of these we've learned over time that we need to ask because of what our clients have told us. So it's a combination of evidence-based practice and practice-based evidence, I guess you could say. And I work with high school students, so these are usually questions we're doing aloud, verbally, or with families, but certainly if you're working with younger kids, these are questions that can be adapted to drawing or art or writing or creating scenes in a sand tray or whatever modality you're using. And I won't go through all of them, but we want to know, what was life like for you? Who took care of you? Some kids will describe childhood in their home countries as incredibly stressful and traumatic, and other kids will describe it as being really ideal and missing it. If parental separation, what was the context? What was that like for you? Did you get to say goodbye? And you can imagine if they didn't, which a lot of kids don't, then there was no closure, right? There was like this open wound that they're waiting for closure, and finally, when they arrive to the United States, they're able to start kind of understanding what that meant to have had a long separation despite never getting to say goodbye. Trauma exposure, one of the things we know in general about screening for trauma is to screen for specifics. If I ask a child, have you been abused or have you gone through trauma, most kids don't know what that means. Many kids may not even understand it's been so normalized. They might not see trauma as trauma. So instead of asking, have you gone through physical abuse or physical trauma or sexual trauma, we'll ask, did any adult ever hit, kick, or punch you on purpose? Did any adult ever force you to touch them on their private parts or do things you didn't want to do on purpose? And they don't always disclose, even when they've experienced it, and we know all the reasons why kids might not disclose something initially, but it at least opens the door and helps give them a vocabulary and know that it is okay to talk about and that their trauma was, in fact, trauma. Why did you come when you did, aka why now? That question is going to give you a lot of data about the context and circumstances in which that child came. You'll have kids talk about having had 24, 48, 72 hours to pack their bags and leave, and not always. Sometimes, though, it has been a long, kind of planned out thing, but in a lot of cases, they come when they did because something really bad happened. Maybe the person taking care of them passed away, or there was a big safety issue that happened in their town, and so we want to know why. And then some common themes that we hear are vulnerability. Kids were less vulnerable to, or at increased vulnerability to things like abuse or mistreatment because of limited structure, limited supervision. The perception of abandonment, even if we know all the reasons why that parent came, if that child feels that they were abandoned, and many kids do, then we start with that because that's that child's truth. An unstable environment, attachment ruptures, but then also autonomy and freedom. We'll hear a lot of kids talk about how they loved in their home country, they could run around. If they were in a rural area, they felt very free, they had a lot of ownership. Then they get here and they feel very enclosed, like they can't leave, like they don't have that autonomy. So actual migration, again, a lot of these were things that we have learned to ask over time. I didn't know what a hielera was and that I should be asking about it until we had our first couple of minor clients talking about this freezing cold room where they were fed a sandwich and shivering under this blanket. So we've learned over time how to adapt our interviews to meet the needs of our clients. Did you eat and drink enough? Did you get sick? This is really important because we will have kids come who, after they arrive here, are so underweight or have so many somatic complaints that before we can even think about therapy, we need to get this kid to a doctor and get them back to their medical baseline. Detention, were you separated from loved ones en route? Were you placed in shelter or foster care? In our previous presenters, I painted a really good picture of what that might look like in that series of events. And then common themes we'll hear as certainly direct trauma exposure en route, robberies, attacks, assaults, being hungry and thirsty, which that alone for a young child is traumatic. And they will carry that experience of going a couple of days without eating, or imagine being in a desert and barely drinking water. Fear, separation, parentification, 12, 13-year-old kids who are then taking care of the welfare of their younger siblings, confusion, chaos, and then certainly pride and resilience. Our immigrant youth, many of them do and rightfully should feel incredibly proud of having been able to navigate such a chaotic and overwhelming experience. And post-migration context, so the what now? Where are we now? Who do you live with? And what is that like? There was parental separation. What was it like to see so-and-so for the first time? How is it now? Many of our recently arrived youth do have new step-parents in their lives or new siblings in their life, and that's incredibly hard. Do you have contact with your family in your home country? Are you concerned about threats or debt? Some of our families are so overwhelmed by the financial stress of bringing their child over. $3,500 is a huge amount of money, especially when we think about the types of jobs that many of our immigrant parents are working. And kids pick up on all that. They see how stressed their parents are, and many times feel guilty or feel burdensome. Are you connected to a clinic, church, community center? Are there places or people in your life that help you feel welcome and safe, secure, ideally at home, but also outside of the home? And then common themes, we see disillusionment. I think this is a word that really resonates for me and captures the experience of a lot of not just our teens or our kids, but also the parents. Disappointment, marginalization, loss. Inherent to being an immigrant is a sense of loss, whether that's loss of a place, a person, a relationship, a home. In some cases, the loss of a sense of stability or a sense of belonging, a loss of being part of the dominant group. But then we also hear a lot of hope, hope for the future and hope for what opportunities they will have as long as they're able to stay. And then working with parents and caregivers or sponsors is a huge part of working with immigrant youth. We use this word really deliberately, partners. We really want to partner with families, including whoever those parents and caregivers and adult allies are, to help support that child's resettlement and reunification. There's a really beautiful, that same group, Fairfax County Public Schools, who developed the Families Reunite curriculum. They have this whole, it's a multi-family group model. So they will bring families together who are reunifying and take them through this curriculum together. It's a really beautiful model. I've got to sit in on a couple of sessions. And one of the things they do before they ever can talk about their child or that family's reunification is take the parents through. What was your immigration experience like? What was your experience of grief and loss like? What was the hardest for you? And they use this as a tool to help them unpack all the baggage that our parents are carrying. Many parents are survivors of trauma themselves and carry with them a lot of feelings of guilt, feelings of shame. You might feel responsible for bad things that happened to their child. And so we really want to try to join with that parent or caregiver as much as we can to then help them build empathy for what it's like to be their child and help support that family's reunification process. And then a really big part of this is case management. And I know we're all in different settings and have different access to resources, but it is an enormous shift to suddenly take back in this country, take on 1, 2, 3 children into your home, whether you're a biological parent or you're a non-biological sponsor. So families need a lot of support financially, logistically, emotionally. And so we've learned that it's really important to, and sometimes that's one of the best things we can do is provide these really tangible supports, because you might be providing the best cognitive behavioral therapy in the world, but if that family doesn't have food, or there's violence in the home, or they don't have a home, it's going to be really hard for that child's depression to get much better. And then, common themes: frustration, disillusionment. Parents, as much as children, sometimes feel disillusioned with the process of how beautiful this reunification moment is going to be, and it's not always. Symptoms of caregiver burnout or fatigue, feeling really exhausted, but then also catharsis. All of this has been so hard, but finally we're together, and finally we can move forward as a family. So I wanted to share just a couple of really concrete interventions that we use when we're working with individual, family, or group settings with immigrant youth. My two favorite are extremely simple, and I really like the image of a backpack, and then the next one, which is involving shoes, because many of our kids come to this country with literally a backpack and their shoes. They arrive here walking. So when we talk about what else is in your backpack, we want to know, what are all these things that you're carrying with you other than your books and your supplies and pens? What else? And these can be things like strong negative emotions, difficult experiences, losses, traumatic experiences. But these are also really positive things, an opportunity to cultivate that individual's awareness of their strengths and of whatever cultural traditions they're able to bring forward, their faith, positive memories, positive relationships, future dreams. These are also an important part of what's in their backpack. So we'll do this sometimes one-on-one or in groups or with families, or in schools where we have an ESL teacher who's really committed to championing the the wellness of ESL students. We've done this with entire classrooms. And then similarly, the walk a mile in my shoes is a really basic concept, but it can also be a really powerful way to help somebody who's struggling to empathize with a child to build empathy. So doing this with a parent to help them access empathy for what it might like to be their child, or even for a teacher who might be having a really hard time connecting or understanding what's going on with the child. And then actually I'm going to go ahead and then I'll come back. So there's a handout in your folders, one English, one Spanish, on family reunification. I didn't write them. They also come out of a group in Virginia. But they're excellent because they go through what are some really common experiences and challenges that immigrant youth will face when they've dealt with family separation and reunification, and then what are some of the really common challenges that parents will go through in this process. And any time that a family is referred to me and there's any degree of parental separation and reunification, I share this and I ask them to read it, or we'll read it together, or we'll review it out loud. Because even if some of you are working not in clinical or not in therapy context, these three parts on this triangle are really, really important. So psychoeducation, offering this is a really important step toward bringing down some of their feelings of shame, is by normalizing, by providing psychoeducation. These are some really common experiences of reunified families. It's really common and normal to feel frustrated or to feel disappointed. It's really common and normal for the process to take a long time, longer than you would expect. We want to offer a lot of psychoeducation on the front end when that seems relevant, then explore what's it been like for you? What's been your experience? And then validate and normalize whatever that family is saying, wherever they are in their reunification process, there they are, and that's where we start. They might be really connected and communicative and empathic with each other. In other families, they're totally estranged. They're avoidant. There's no relationship development. They're not able to talk about it. And in both cases, one of the basic tenets of trauma-informed care is that at any point in time, individuals, and I would say also families, are doing the best with what they got. So we want to meet that family wherever they're at, and maybe spend our time on different parts of this triangle depending on the family and depending on your role. The goal being, we want to decrease shame, blame, and reactivity. We want to increase empathy, connection, and hope. So how do we do that? For those of you who are doing therapy, some of you might be play therapists or structural therapists or psychodynamic therapists. In a way, it doesn't matter, because what we're doing is providing a space for that family to start developing a new normal, right? Both that child and that parent had an idea of what it was going to look like, and everyone in that family is now having to adapt to what new normal looks like and having to recreate an identity as a family. And I included the elephant in the room comic because I think it's really salient. We work with families who have been reunified for years and have never really been able to talk about it. Why? Because it's really uncomfortable, it's really hard, it's really painful, which is why we're here. These slides were written a couple of weeks ago, but we know that regardless of the crisis of the last 2 weeks, many of our immigrant families have been living in a state of crisis or survival for years. We know that our clients don't exist in a vacuum. We don't work in a vacuum, and all of us, regardless of your politics, are impacted by what's going on in the larger systems, and all of that trickles down to our families. So some of the things that we've seen over the last couple of years, and it tends to ebb and flow. Sometimes it's reactionary after an event, like an election or an inauguration or a raid in the community or at a family friend's workplace. But seeing things like separation anxiety from parents. I work in a high school that's co-located with an elementary school, and in both the high school and the elementary school, we were seeing kids this school year who didn't want to come to school because they were terrified that their parent wouldn't be there waiting for them when they got home. Elementary kids who were crying because that 5- or 6-year-old was making the calculation that my parent might get deported today. An increase in somatic symptoms, headaches, muscle aches, a lot of gastric complaints. Kids will, they're able to talk about feeling like they have a hard time going to the bathroom, feeling constipated or having a really upset stomach, diarrhea. We know all of that's linked to toxic stress, and certainly an increase in emotional and behavioral symptoms. Because there's been a lot of attention in the media in the last couple of weeks about the trauma of the actual border crossing. So, what happens at the border? What happens at the detention facility? Thinking about unaccompanied minors, that's just one thing in the context of all these other layers of trauma, of the parental separation, reunification process, of things that they've experienced in their home communities or in their home countries. And so we see a lot of kids who are endorsing symptoms of PTSD, who clearly meet the diagnostic criteria for PTSD, but it's not necessarily linked to one event. The PCLC, which is a screening tool that we use for assessing PTSD, talks about the event. Do you have flashbacks about the trauma, or do you have nightmares about the trauma? But a lot of our kids cannot identify a singular trauma, right? It's a set of circumstances that have come together to create an enormous amount of instability in a child's life. And we're now, I think, with the research, really starting to understand what is the impact of toxic stress exposure. Because when a child is always, for weeks or months or years on end, a little bit anxious or a little bit worried or a little bit scared, that physically changes how both their body and their brain operates, which means that fear, that anxiety might become their new baseline. And so when their normal baseline otherwise would be calm and okay, and something stressful happens and you deal with it and you get over it, when being a little bit stressed all the time becomes your new baseline, then when something activates that fight or flight system, it's a lot harder to recover, especially if you don't have a supportive and stable home, family, and community environment around you. Avoidance or school, health, and social services is a big one, and it was a really concerning one for us this year. We had a lot of families who, I should say, in DC, we're very blessed with universal coverage, which means that anyone who's a DC resident is eligible for public health insurance as long as you're under the income threshold, regardless of documentation status. But we had a lot of families who were scared to either apply or go renew because it requires going into a government building and essentially declaring yourself to be undocumented. That's terrifying, thinking about the context that our families are living in. So we had families who either didn't want to go to apply or deliberately let their insurance lapse because they were making the calculation that I'd rather do that than put my whole family at risk just by maintaining health insurance. So on the flip side of that, we saw a lot of truancy because families were scared about, is school a safe place for me? Are we going to get picked up at school? Untreated illness, kids were missing medical appointments or therapy appointments. If either family had a medical emergency, they didn't know what to do, they would go to the hospital. Fear of calling police for safety issues, there's domestic violence in the home or something happens in an apartment building, but families are scared because the prospect of a police knocking on your door and coming into your apartment, even if it's for something totally different, is rightfully terrifying. Feelings of discrimination and non-belonging. There was a research study out of Texas that found that one of the biggest predictors or correlating factors to mental wellness among immigrant adults was the perception of discrimination. And then community marginalization and isolation. The concern is that the entire community feels like they need to sort of go into hiding, which means it's our responsibility as providers to try to undo that by taking an active and really affirming, welcoming stance toward re-engaging these families. So how do we do that? How do we mitigate the impact of trauma? Or said differently, how do we build resilience in our families? I think we're also still learning about what factors help, predict whether a child is able to sink or swim in the face of trauma, or how resilient they're able to be. We certainly know that the quality of caregiver bonds and family relationships is an incredibly predictive factor. From our end, through school-based mental health programming, we focus on school and community-based programming that is responsive to both the needs and the strengths of the immigrant community, regardless of documentation status. So starting always with relationships. We know that trauma occurs or can occur in the context of relationships, but recovering from trauma or healing from trauma also occurs in the context of relationships, of safe, consistent, stable, nurturing relationships, ideally starting at home, ideally by starting with strengthening whatever attachment might exist between the child and their caregivers or in their biological family. Not always. Sometimes kids will say, I'm not ready to talk to my parents, but I have an aunt or an uncle who I feel really good with, and sometimes I stay with them on weekends. And so if that's the case, and that's an ally for that child, then we work with that. That's where we start. And then we also want to focus on their relationships with people outside of the home, with trusting adults, with us as their doctor, therapist, or nurse, or medical provider, to show that we're comfortable, we're willing to ask questions. We want to know what it's like for them. We want to bring them in. And then, beyond that, creating really affirming, welcoming environments in school settings and community clinics and hospitals that take an active stance toward language access, of having bilingual materials, of when we're worried about a family, seeing if we can do a home visit, or finding ways to really go be intentional about reengaging that family. And then trauma-informed education and medical care, we do a lot of consultation in schools because we know that outside of the therapy, students are spending 7.5 hours a day in that school building. And so it's not just do they feel good, do they feel respected and heard by us, but do they feel like their teachers, their administrators, their principals understand, or at least have a basic understanding of what it's like to be them, that they might have unique needs and strengths, and creating school environments or medical environments that are really tuned to that. Know Your Rights workshops, we did a lot of that over the last couple of years. And then extracurricular and youth development programming, which I was glad that you touched on also, because this is a huge deal for kids, because we want to create these little microcosms of communities within their community, groups, places where they feel safe and they feel competent, they feel connected, and they feel welcome. So these can be things like a club, a therapy group, a sport, a community program, any other context where kids can feel like they are not alone is going to make enormous inroads over their ability to be resilient throughout their reunification process. All of the above, working to foster resiliency, connection, and hope. So sometimes I wish that the youth I work with could be here presenting with me, but this is the last week of school. I'm running a charter school, and we run a lot of therapy groups for newcomer students. And so I said, I'm going to be giving this presentation at Children's this week, and they're like, whoa, if you want, and it's totally optional, if you want to respond, consider and give some input. So what do we need to know as adults who are in your community? We're working with you. What do you wish more people knew about what it's like to be you? So I'm going to end just with their, these are direct quotes, although it's my translation from Spanish to English. One said that learning English is really difficult. I didn't used to be a shy person, but I feel shy now when I speak in English. I don't feel like myself. And maybe anyone in this room who has been an immigrant can identify or relate with that. That life in the U.S. is so hard, but still it's better than in my country. Here we have many more opportunities to study, to become someone, and this girl had been through a lot here. She said it's still better. I wouldn't go back. And then I heard the opposite. Even though my country has lots of problems, I'd rather be there with my family. When I turn 18 and get my diploma, I hope to go back so I can help my community. I want to go home. This isn't home. I want to go home. And then that many of us had to grow up really quickly, or have to go up really quickly. I never really got to be a kid. And then second question, in spite of all this, how have we been resilient? What helps? What is giving you strength or hope or resiliency? We heard knowing how much my mom has sacrificed makes me want to keep going, which requires a degree of empathy and that child being able to see and understand that it hasn't been easy for their parent either. My faith in God, having people at school who knew my situation and weren't afraid to ask about it. It's really profound. Being able to go to my counselor to cry and let it all out so that my past didn't affect me so much, so having places to go. And then attending groups with other immigrant kids helped me feel like I wasn't so alone. So that is it. I have a couple of my favorite resources. BRICS and NCTSN are really good. They have a lot of bilingual handouts and materials, not just in English and Spanish, but in other languages too. And a lot of it is very kind of honed in on working with immigrant refugee youth and families. And then the SCPS curriculum, is there anyone in the room who represents that program by chance? It's really good. They will do these multifamily group workshops, and they are incredibly powerful. And then this is a workbook that's in English and Spanish that you can do or pull from when you're working with individuals or with families to, again, help normalize and contextualize their experience. Below is my contact information. You're welcome to reach out anytime, and I thank you from the bottom of my heart for being here, because just by being here and being invested in this issue, regardless of your role and your setting, makes a big difference toward creating a community where these kids can feel welcome and hopeful for their future. Thank you.
So we do have some time. We have 10 minutes before our scheduled break. So if you guys have some questions for this talk and the first one as well, you can go ahead with those. Any questions? Hey, all right. Oh, yes.
It sounds like in DC it is possible to get
How old is he? My understanding, and if there's anyone here who knows Montgomery County resources better than I do, is that Montgomery County? It depends on county. My understanding is that in Montgomery County they have what's called Care for Kids, which is public insurance for undocumented youth, but that when you turn 18, it might, in some cases it might be 21, but when you become an adult, that drops off. Whereas in Prince George's County, unless anything has changed recently, which I don't think it has, there's essentially no public benefit support for undocumented families. But I could be wrong. There might be others in the room who know more. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Your question, is that okay to do? I would say absolutely. I think with any client, not just immigrant clients, but I think generally our systems tend to be very siloed. Education, this is outpatient care, this is outpatient medical care, this is mental health care. But I think one of the most important parts of, especially with really complex cases, is care coordination and really good communication, which I think also helps kids feel held and supported and cared for when they know that as long as they've given their permission, that people are talking and working together on their behalf. Otherwise, they feel like they're bouncing around and retelling their story and feel very, I think, like they're being strained. So as long as that child or family gives consent, I think not only is it okay, I think it's excellent.
And I would also add that a lot of the departments here at Children's also has a psychologist, and I'm the one with the heart and kidney. So if your department has a psychologist or a social worker, I think they would be a great resource to connect to. So if you ask some of your patients, like if you have services, if you have, whether at Mary Center or somewhere else, if you have a therapist, or if you assess, or in your assessment it comes up that they have some maybe mental health concerns and you want to kind of follow up on that, connecting with some of the social workers and the psychologists if you have one, and they can connect with the counselors and get the appropriate information. I think I would definitely recommend that as well. We have a couple of hands. Go ahead.
I have a question for both of the answers. The relationship between what is spoke and the connection. How it's based on what's happening, sort of how it's changing, how it may or may not be. Or for the West Center, we have some more programs, and that we're trying to incorporate local solutions and that includes the study and things like that.
I mean, I think certainly acknowledging that, trauma, we know that one of the things we know about trauma is that it gets stored in the body, that even when it happens pre-verbal, pre-memory, even when kids go through traumatic things that they don't remember because it happened before they were able to really encode those memories, it gets stored in the body and carry it forward. And so it makes sense that it can then translate into long-term physical and emotional health outcomes. The idea behind the ACE study is that the more traumatic events you're exposed to, the more ACEs you have, which stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences, the more vulnerable or susceptible you are to major long-term negative health outcomes, and the higher the correlation is. And so I think the research is speaking for itself, which corroborates probably what a lot of us who work in this field already know, which is that the more bad things that kids go through at a young age, the more vulnerable they are as adults to negative health and mental health outcomes, which means the more critical it is to intervene as quickly as we can to help not only try to decrease their symptoms, but increase their protective factors and the resiliency factors. And it also speaks to the importance of making sure that they all have really good medical care and that their medical providers and mental health providers are talking, because we see so much overlap in both. And I think we're still also starting to learn like how can physicians feel confident in assessing for mental health symptoms? How can us as mental health professionals feel comfortable asking, knowing what to ask, to know what conversations we should be having?
I think we have time for one more question, a quick one, please.
Very interested all immigrant populations, not just the Hispanic ones. So I can refer.
Thank you so much for saying that. We began in the 80s serving women who were fleeing violence from Central America who needed prenatal and postnatal care. So that's how we started, and kind of the image in the community has always been a place where Central American or Spanish-speaking families would go, but absolutely. And it doesn't have to be just immigrant populations. We serve many native-born families too, and it's a perception we're actively trying to change, that we by no means only speak Spanish, serve Spanish speakers.
It used to be that I could print out that was no longer available. That's now still possible.
What kind of information?
Just a general Mary Sandra.
I don't know, but I can certainly find out. I think our website was.
Yeah. Go online to Mary Center, and you get it all in English, and you see. And then it stops being here.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. So we do have.
Yeah.
Give me your email address, I'll give you the contact information and help give you a document, private insurance, I'll give you the information.
All right, that's excellent. Okay, so so we're going to take a quick 15-minute break. If you guys can please come back at 11, we're going to start with the next session. If you have not signed in, or if you did not come in early enough to sign in, please do sign in. There are sign-in sheets.
Real quickly, announcement about evaluations. Please make sure that you receive an evaluation, especially if you're in need of education credit. So there will be 3 of us with the evaluations up front, so please make sure you get one, and make sure also that you sign in, especially if you need the evaluation credit.
Yes, the evaluation forms are at the end, at the back, with Dr. Reed.
you know where to find me. You know my people. So I'm always happy to chat, touch base about anything. I'll be back on my link. That's practical for that, but then bringing it to this topic. Yeah, and links too. Yeah, elementary. So like when we're elementary readers, which ones we're going to go for bilingual. So,
right.
So then take a quick snap. I'm just sharing that because you work with
that's
right? And I like
in between
psychologists.
So either way, so the only reason we have to separate it because they have to put rules for how you get credit. So however you get credit.
I thought, I was like,
she's got a
she does have me.
but
and then okay. That's really awesome reading you after all these years. That's really awesome reading you.
yeah, definitely.
Have fun.
Yeah, thank you.
It is, but this is what social probably don't need credit. So if you're interested in getting credit, it's probably more sense to sign up and read There's some disciplines that you have to take on it, others yeah, so I'm making my see you and did you register online? I did. So it must be under other. But if you're interested in the credit, then I would sign there's blank slots. Are there credits? This is what we're talking about. So I don't know because I'm not familiar with education credit criteria for that group. But what I was saying is, if you all are able to use credits through the American Psychological Association sponsored or the National Social Work sponsored.
I think probably both, but if we just put down LTC
so I would actually, that's fine, but then I would also sign in under the social psychology. And then that way we can get you all.
Okay.
If those credits work, then we can make sure we can get those. Okay, if that makes sense. So you might get kind of.
I'll try to go through psychology.
Why don't you put your names on the both?
On both?
Because,
really? Yeah. Is it going to be on 3 different lists?
Because that way, a lot of the folks that are under other are not necessarily getting credit, but we're asking for the state. But that way we can try to, if one doesn't work, then we can hopefully work. Oh, yeah. Hi. I know we met at the I did get your yeah, no, I'm not okay.
You should put down LPC, Karen. I'm gonna put down for you, okay?
No, that's okay.
Okay, sorry. How are you doing?
Okay. And then that way.
The last 2 names.
Okay, so hopefully through one of those groups that will work out. Okay, great. Thank you. the psychology policy.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you.
That's good. Technically, I'll have one by the end of the summer. When people turn in their evaluation. Oh, yes, ma'am, we do. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, I'll step back.
You said it through. here.
Welcome back, everyone. If you could please take your seats, we're going to get started. Hello. Okay, there might be people still trickling in, but if everyone could take their seats, please. Thank you. So up next, we have Dr. Sandra Barreuco talking to us about the role of language. But before that, we do have a couple of announcements. So if you guys did not come in early enough to hear me talk about the Cs and everything, we do have the sign-in sheet over there in that corner. Even if you are not applying for Cs or if you're not here for Cs, if you could please sign in so that we can know how many people came and who attended. And also we're going to be sending out the slides and some additional information, particularly regarding, kind of advocacy and like things like that. So please do sign in. We would really appreciate that. And so hopefully all of you got the evaluation forms. We're passing them out. If you did not get an evaluation form, we have them also at the back over there. And if you could all fill those out and return them before you leave, because that's how you'll get the CE credits. So for everyone else, so the CNEs, we have the certificates here with me today, but others, you'll get this, the CE credits from your respective organizations later on. So it could take up to a couple of weeks, perhaps. I'm not sure. So do be on the lookout for that. If you don't get it within a couple of weeks, I would say, give us contact us and let us know. But we'll try to get that done as soon as possible, and it will also depend on the organizations. All right. And also for the additional information about Cs, we're going to send out as well, particularly for the CMEs, because you'll have to go to INOVA's website to do that. So we'll keep you guys informed. Right. Am I missing anything else? I think we're good. All right.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Well, this mic looks like it's off. I'm not sure. So you can hear me okay, though? Oh, wonderful. Well, I want to acknowledge my doctoral student, Geraldine Fernandez de la Rosa Lopez. She is actually finishing her PhD as an intern at DuPont, so she has rotated through here at Children's, and has many great things to say. So I want to acknowledge some of her contributions as well as her dissertation. I'm going to start off by discussing many questions related to, that come up when talking about immigrant children related to bilingualism and multilingualism. As we saw with what Rachel discussed, something that one of their children wanted to share was how difficult it is to learn English at times and what can facilitate that process. Many parents and providers have questions. Well, is this typical? Is this atypical? What are some of the factors that can contribute to success in this area? And then I'll give it a broader perspective in terms of language, in terms of family communication patterns, and touch upon an intervention that we recently concluded, supporting families who have been separated and are now reunified. I'll also touch upon assessment practices and how can we improve some of our assessment practices related to linguistics. I run the Multicultural Research Laboratory for Young Children and Families. Our work is at the center of this interaction between mental health and linguistics and cultural processes. And some of my research touches upon these four cornerstones, but it really comes together to hopefully make an impact in these trajectories. First, we're going to focus on some of the prevalence rates. And before I do that, because people always like to do that, we need to talk about terminology, because there's sometimes in our communication with each other as professionals, some of our best practices, some of our recommendations, and some of our thoughts get lost in some of the terms that we use. And yet they're important and they're critical, and some of them are legally tied. So in terms of timing, children can learn two languages or more simultaneously. So they're born here, or they're learning 2 languages in their home country, and so we call these simultaneous bilinguals. Secondly, we have a term called sequential bilinguals. You might see that also in the field and in articles that you might be interested in pulling up. And those are those that have established a first language, and then after about the age of 5 or 6, learn a second language. And some of you might fall into one of these camps, or you in 2 of these camps. 1 language you started learning, or 2 languages you'll start learning in early childhood as an infant, and later on pulled on and brought in a 3rd language. There are also differences in terms of bilingualism in terminology related to proficiency. For example, you might have heard of English language learners, emergent bilinguals, or limited English proficients, and LEPs. Some of this terminology comes to us from the Department of Education, Department of Labor, and different nuances in the term. But generally speaking, they have a similar flavor. These are individuals or children who are in the process of developing their English language proficiency, that are in the early steps of doing so, starting to develop reading and writing and speaking and writing. Then there are important other terms that we discussed in the field, broader terms. Dual language learners, which is actually a very hot term. How many of you have heard dual language learners? Right? It's a newer term in the last 8 to 10 years, I would say, that's really come into the mainstream. But this broader umbrella of understanding that, let's say after individuals have developed English proficiency, they speak 2 languages. The broader term of bilingual, the broader term of multilingual. And so there's a lot more research that's being conducted understanding who is this broader population and how do they develop, versus just focusing on those who are in the early steps of English language proficiency. And as providers, you'll be seeing a mix of these different individuals and children. And also as children move from one to another, they were English language learners, and now they're dual language learners. In this talk, I will be using the word multilingualism as a broader term. And then every so often you'll hear me say English language learner, and I want you to zero in on the child that's in those early stages of English language learning. More than 1/4 of young children across the United States are bilingually developing, and 3/4 are Spanish speakers. And in many states and counties, you see this represented. We're going to be talking about Washington, D.C. specifically. But there are a number of states, especially some of the Midwestern states, some of the Southern states, that have historically said, oh, we've heard of multilinguals, we've heard of bilingual children, and all of a sudden they see influxes as families are spreading across the nation looking for what is called the good life. Right, trying to find a place actually of security for their families. I'm presently conducting a nationally representative study of migrant farm workers and their young children, and we see them really all over the nation. And in some states where we get calls, shows a 200% growth in just a 10-year period. In Washington, D.C., 1/4 of residents, including adults, are bilingual. 14% of the children in the public school systems are at that early process of developing English. And we're going to come back to that and discuss what that means educationally and psychologically. And the vast majority, very, very similar to national prevalence rates, 3/4 of the bilingual individuals in the DC area are Spanish speaking, exactly the same percentage nationally, but there's so much variety. And I know we see it here in children's. 147 languages just within our borders of DC. But the most prevalent languages beyond Spanish are listed here. Let's discuss the development of multilingualism. And I want you to step back and think about some of the main questions you have, right? I'd love to hear about those as we get towards the end, as I open it up for questions. So think about what are some of the myths that you've heard, the questions about, how is it that children develop well? How does it actually happen naturally? What can we do to support that? And I'll be highlighting today, I'm really, because it's a 50-minute talk, really highlighting the top things I would like for you to walk away with, okay? And versus going really deep in some pieces of the psychological and cognitive research. So multilingualism. A question that I'm often asked is like, well, what is it? What are all these different types and forms that are out there? Many people think about this hierarchy or this optimal outcome of high, we call it, where an individual, a child, speaks English as fluently as possible without any semblance of an accent, as well as in their native language, their home language. And then we have other balanced bilinguals, though, that we call low-low, which they're struggling in both languages. Okay, and there's a term in the field, I'm not a big fan of it because it's a bit negative, called semi-lingual. But if you're interested in this body of research and looking into some of the literature, that's a term that you can look up. One of the things important to know, as much as parents and communities and providers and teachers, psychologists, social workers are really interested in helping children get to the high level, it's actually less likely. And that is okay, and that's normative. And there's a big push and there's a lot of pressure on families and children for them to become completely proficient in all the languages that they speak. Think about yourself for a second. All of you, I would imagine, have gone through some kind of foreign language learning program or studied abroad or, tried to attempt to learn a second language. Maybe you are fully bilingual, maybe you were raised bilingually or multilingually. Think to yourself, are you there? Are you high yourself? And what are some of the factors that have impeded that, aside of actually wanting to? And many people think that, well, maybe the immigrant families and these children aren't there yet because they don't really care. And I have definitely heard that in the field. They don't really care, so they're not trying hard enough. There are factors that we'll discuss that prevent that. Optimally, it can happen. It can definitely happen cognitively. And socioculturally, there are other countries that are more likely to have children become fully bilingual in multiple languages. But in our society, in terms of the prevalence rates and when they use different languages and how, it's less likely. Okay. So it's important to kind of step back and think about what are the expectations, even though we would like that to happen, and the pressures on the children. What's more likely is something called unbalanced bilingualism, that there is a dominant language, and that it varies over time. So children might have their native home language be the dominant language early on. As they start preschool or early childhood programs, it shifts to English. As they engage maybe in DC is very interesting because we have a lot of immersion programs here. They engage in immersion program, it shifts back and forth, and that is normative with the ebbs and flow of life. And then there's another piece here is the concern, though, sometimes about the non-dominant language. Well, what's happening there? We're going to get to when to be concerned. What's very important, bottom line, things for you to walk away with, if their dominant language is very nicely developed, they're doing okay. The non-dominant language is a plus for them. Where we get concerned clinically is where it's a low-low. You should not be hearing from parents that they don't speak well in either language. You might hear from parents that can't communicate with them very well because they're learning English and now they're more proficient in English, but their brother and sister, the teacher says they're doing fine. And there is a period there where we know that there is that shift, or maybe there's even a silent period as children are learning and shifting between their dominance levels, and that can happen and can take a couple of months, but it should not last very long. Some of the most prominent cases I've ever seen clinically were, let's say it was a child with autism, but they assumed that they're nonverbal because of bilingualism. And it's very clearly the case, they don't speak to anyone. And they're on the autistic spectrum. Another term that we might hear is passive bilingualism, where there's a high level of understanding. And we see this when we go out just walking the hallway, or you go into a restaurant, or you go into the grocery store, where the mother or the father is speaking, let's say Spanish, and the child is completely understanding it because you could see their face. Either they're very excited to hear what mom or dad are saying, or they're not, right? You've been in that situation maybe yourself if you're a parent or a child yourself, right? But when they speak back, what language do they speak? They speak English. And so there's these variations also in bilingualism that is not just all in one area. We call this passive bilingualism. I have a more general term called a rock on the tongue phenomenon. And have you felt that way yourself, where you understood what someone is saying, but you can't speak back to them at the same level of proficiency as you were thinking? So there are different developmental sequences for expressiveness, for receptiveness, for writing, and we're going to talk about what the natural course is. So domains, understanding, speaking, reading, and writing, and they are listed there in the normal trajectory, where you first understand, then you speak, then you can start to read and write. Now, they don't all have to be sequenced that way, but you become more and more proficient as you go along. Think of yourself writing in your second language or third language. Think about yourself understanding, and you understand there are different kind of trajectories along that way. In terms of those of you that are really excited and really want to look into the literature, we have terms, right? All of us have terms in our field. So instead of doing like a Google search or a PsycInfo search or Medline search for understanding, speaking second language, you'd actually put in communicative language, or the technical term for reading and writing in a second language or multiple languages is cognitive academic language proficiency, and you'll see a lot of literature. Other questions, and here I throw it open to you, okay? Is there a sensitive period? Is there a critical period for learning a second language? Are children better than adults in second language learning? By a show of hands, how many of you say children, of course we are children, are better than adults in second language learning? Ah, very interesting. Where am I going with this? You're like, let's see. So of course, many things in science, there's a yes and a no to that, okay? Bottom line, you're all right, because how could we be wrong? Our gut reaction as human beings. But there are reasons for it, okay? One is that there is a sensitive period for accents. They're more likely to happen if a child has not heard a second language until after age 7 or 8. And you can think about individuals who have better grammar than you, right, that have been here 30, 40 years. They're phenomenal. They still have an accent, correct? And we can go into some of the psychomotor reasons for why this happens, but it's helpful to know that accents are not an indicator of proficiency. They're an indicator of when onset of second language learning occurred, okay? So parents can feel very ashamed, that's like the true word coming from their mouths. Kids can be ashamed of their parents, which you've seen, for having an accent, because many people make it feel, well, that means that you don't speak English, you haven't wanted to learn English, and it's not. It's another system at play. Cognitive capacity. So children and adults are just as good as each other in second language learning cognitively, which is great news for all of us. Okay, so you can all go out there and buy whatever little resource you want, you know. I recently wanted to try to learn Italian, and I was like, and I'll tell you reasons. I know cognitively I can go to that, but wow, I was having issues. Adults, and this is helpful for telling parents and telling doctors and telling physicians and telling other social workers and other psychologists, it's not too late for the parents to learn English. They have the same ultimate end cognitively, but we use different processes. Children, you know, they are this, what we call the sponge. We're going to talk about that fallacy a little bit later, though. They have some capacity through statistical learning. They're listening for all these phonemes that are coming this way, and we're able to really pick it up pretty quickly. Positively, you and I have some nice higher order cognitive processes that have developed over time. We understand grammatical structure. We understand syntax. We understand that there are sentences, that there are words, and our brain tries to, you know, pretty much crack that nut of the language from a different perspective. But in the end, it's very interesting. In the end, we can learn just as well as children, okay? So there's the great positive news. But why do I say in the end we're all right that kids ultimately, if we take out just really focusing on cognitive processes, do get there faster for second language learning? What are some ideas? What is it that kids have that grown-ups sometimes? Time, memory. Well, sometimes we have memory lapses, right? Cognitive flexibility, which we could talk about. Yep. What? They're not afraid. That's actually an important piece and a good predictor from the science, is that psychologically, personality-wise, they're going after it. You know, they want to play at the playground during recess, and they want to play with those blocks. They want to hang out, and they push themselves a bit more. I think, you know, Rachel, you were talking about some hesitancy that happens, right? How many of you felt hesitant speaking in your non-dominant language? There's so much more that we want to say, and we know we can say it. Kids, they're still developing their first language, so they're like, hey, I know there's stuff I can't say, and I can't say it right. I have some grammatical errors in both languages, so I'm going to go for it as well. So we have that big hesitancy issue that occurs. The second important one is time. We were talking about how earlier presenters are talking about the time. The parents are working so hard, and so are you, right? So that can get into the play. So these two different processes are important. And the third is, which we're going to get into educational techniques, is that there's less provided for adults to use their cognitive processes and make adult language learning in a second language more available to second language learners. And I can go into that for a while. All right, so in the end, children win, but it's not because they're only because of cognitive capacity, okay? How long does it take to become proficient in 2 languages? You tell me. For those of you that have gone down this route, how long did it take you? I hear mumble. I think it's, what do you, a lifetime? What? Right. You'll say if you're really trying and you've moved to a second country, or let's say family's coming here, 6 months. Others? Lifetime, somewhere between? 5 years. 5 years, good. All right, you ready? I'm giving you like the big snapshots of research, okay? Yes and yes, right? It's actually not necessarily always a lifetime. And there is, of course, individual variation, which I'm happy to answer questions about. The bottom line, when we have a child that comes to this country, how long do we wait and see? How long do we wait and refer them for? Like I mentioned before, we never want to see any language ever dip, maybe just for a month or 2 as they're switching their dominance. But we want to see strong language proficiency in at least 1 language. But right now I'm focusing on how long does it take to develop that second language. You understand the difference between that? My clinical advice to you is make sure there's always a strong language at play, but that second language, how long does it take for it to really come on board? And there's 2 parts to this. One, for second language learning, those that are immigrants to this country, same type of data and results for children as for adolescents as for adults, which is very fascinating. It takes 2 to 3 years to develop very strong, and I mean strong, almost similar to monolinguals, native speakers, communicative language. And by communicative language, I mean having a conversation at a coffee shop, in the hallway, but a pretty decent one, not just asking, hi, can I find the bathroom? But a good conversation where much is understood and much can be spoken back 2 to 3 years. And sometimes that can be surprising. Some people say, well, within a year, but true, deep proficiency, 2 to 3 years in communication, speaking and understanding. Different for reading and writing. Takes a bit longer. Again, step back and think about yourself. What processes are involved in that, but also, we use different vocabulary when we read and write. True? The way that I'm speaking now is actually quite different than how I write. My students will tell you, like, oh, she writes differently. It's a different type of grammatical approach. It's a little bit different a big difference of a vocabulary. That's why we always say read to children early and often, because it introduces them to a different type of world. But 5 to 7 years. Yeah.
Because English is backwards for like every other language.
Yeah, English is a fun one. Where it's like, and there's something different about English, but there's always this rule. So yes, the more similar the language is to English, the easier it is, and the quicker it happens. That's why there's some variation here. But it can surprise people. Wow, it takes a child 5 to 7 years. So if they come and they're in 1st grade, where are we at? Right, to get to full, and I mean strong proficiency of reading and writing in a second language. They're coming along. It's not that they're not there, but it takes a long time to understand all the words on paper. And they're trying to also keep up with all those other children that are born here, that are monolingual, that take English classes. They're learning so many words, hundreds, right, words a day. So they're trying to do a lot of catch-up. Now, people are surprised by this, and I want you to kind of think about this from a different perspective. Again, I want you to try to memorize this and bring it forth with you. How long does it take a child that, just in general, to speak and have a conversation with you if they've never, just 1 language? Let's say the child is born, they're a cute baby, except when they're crying, right? Even though I'm not crying. So how long does it take for an infant to start talking and communicating and have a conversation with you? Where are we at? You know, they start with that one-word stuff. At 18 months, we've got some nice little telegraphic speech, which is so much fun, but a nice conversation back and forth where you're just laughing hysterically. 2 to 3. When do children start to write their name, start to write sentences, start to write little stories? They're about 5 or 6, but they're a hoot too because they're so fun. Interestingly, it maps on sequentially in terms of time to how long it also takes a child to learn a second language. So sometimes people say, well, that's a long time. Well, it takes many humans, and here in the United States, many years to develop the ability to have a conversation, many years to read and write. So having the same kind of sequencing is actually normative for second language learners. So the immigrant families that are really concerned know that they're getting there, but they're also playing catch up because this is not just doing it. They're trying to catch up to the monolinguals, and they will get there. And actually, in some places, surpass them, which is awesome, right? It's interesting. In terms of children that are born learning 2 languages simultaneously at the same time, when we look across, let's say English and Spanish are learning both languages at the same time, their language capacity and ability should be pretty similar, okay, to monolinguals. It can be a little bit slower, let's say within English or within Spanish, because sometimes they say, well, they're learning 2 languages at the same time, is that detrimental? It's not necessarily, because we're looking at their capacity across 2 languages. Quick big question I always get is, well, what's the best educational practice? And I'm breaking it down to you in one slide today, okay? I'm happy to answer questions, so just big picture answers for you. First of all, it's important to know that there is a federal law mandating that children who are the early stages, that tip of English language learning, are provided with specialized educational programs to facilitate their educational progress. And the reasons why is very simple. If I start speaking to you in Spanish right now, some of you will do great, which would be awesome, and others will not be understanding the content of what I'm saying. Your brain will actually start trying to decipher Spanish, which is fantastic too, but you won't be learning the content of what I'm trying to say. So in 1974, there was a law that was placed that there has to be something to help that child bridge and understand the content of science classes, social science classes, mathematics classes. And there is annual testing, sometimes twice a year, classification or reclassification to see whether that child necessitates educational services. So for your providers, some of your children may be in specialized ESL classes, bilingual classes, because they have been identified as being early in the stages of English language learning and that this could impede them academically. There are many forms, and I can get into the whole body of literature focused on that. What's really critical is that without any, children do fall behind academically and cognitively in terms of brain capacity and so forth. So there are many different variations, and all are upheld in different and put into place in different places. You might have heard of bilingual education that does use the first language as they develop their second language so that they can learn content as they're going along. There's a great body of literature showing that two-way bilingual programs where there's a mix of children and instruction is happening in both languages throughout the day helps everyone. It has really beautiful cognitive outcomes, really wonderful academic outcomes. Children in sheltered English immersion and ESL classes actually learn English quite quickly, which is lovely, but then they can plateau in their content areas, which we don't want happening either. But the very basic, we can't always implement all the programs everywhere. You need to have something, and the science is clear on that. Question is, well, why learn multiple languages? What are some of the disadvantages? Because not everything is a win-win, and we want to be clear about that. And can children with disabilities become bilingual? Basic bottom line is that research shows that there's greater cognitive capacity in some domains, especially linguistically, for multilingual individuals. And also, when we get to the tail end of our beautiful lives, and that it can delay cognitive processes and kind of curtail some onset of dementia among the elderly in terms of the active cognitive processing. And if you think of yourself speaking two languages and sometimes switching back and forth or just working in your second language, you can know some of the cognitive onboarding that takes place and it keeps people very active. But in terms of a deficit, because it's helpful to always think about something as having a cost, is that there can be slower response times. So if we're doing some timed assessments clinically, linguistically, the bilingual children are likely going to be slower. This is a pretty replicated finding, okay? And that's an important one because sometimes bilingual individuals might, because our society really emphasizes being quick, being quick, being quick. And families, especially as they're developing their second language, but even so after, might have a little bit more milliseconds, multi-milliseconds, you know, that go by. And people can get frustrated with them, impatient with themselves. And it's part of the normative sequence. Bottom line on children with disabilities, bilingualism is not a detriment. It's not going to cause confusion. It's not going to cause delayed development in their treatment programs. Families that are told, okay, now just speak English because your child has autism, but they speak Spanish at home, we're actually causing more family conflict and issues. We want is strong linguistic input, no matter what the language. We want grammar coming in, no matter what the language. And it does not cause disabilities. And if a child has, let's say, a language disorder in one language, guess what? It'll be there for the second language, and it's not an indicator that they can't learn that second language. It means that they have a language disorder. Key points that I want you to also walk away with is the maintenance of this first language is important. We're more likely for children to get into a semi-lingual state where they don't have strong cognitive linguistic capacity in any language if we tell parents, and we have providers tell parents in schools, don't use that first language at all. They're not going to understand anything. They're not going to understand the content. They're not going to understand some of the deeper processes that are needed to happen. So it's extremely important. Also, you might hear something called code switching or interlanguage. And that's when there's the use of, within a sentence, within a paragraph, within a conversation of multiple languages. And that is really, sometimes it's done proactively because there's an interplay, you can play with different words. But also sometimes it's cognitive. It's like, well, I don't know the word in that one language, so I will use it in the other language. And that's pulling from both linguistic capacities. We're not containers and have two separate language sections for all the different languages that we have. We pull from what we know so that we can communicate, and communication is the most important part of this all. So it's not an indicator of a disability. It's an indicator of the brain actually working well, but also maybe that one of those languages could use some shoring up. It's developing. Dominant shifts are common. And then second language learning is gradual, okay? I know we say children are sponges a lot because it makes us really excited, and it's wonderful and it's exciting to say that to parents, but sometimes that can make them think, well, that's just going to happen overnight. Children are going to learn English overnight. They're going to learn Spanish overnight. They're going to learn the third language overnight, and that's undue pressure on everyone, and it makes people feel like there's something wrong. And it could also make people worried about a disorder. And we have an issue in the field where we underdiagnose children with developmental disabilities before starting school because we're waiting to see. And then we overdiagnose disabilities once children get to school. And so why didn't they hurry up and learn their language? So we have to be very thoughtful about it. And then there is individual variation, and I can answer questions about that because sometimes you've met someone and you're like, really? They learned that so quickly, right? And others that do take some time. Clinical best practice. Now that you know that accents can be more of just a marker of when they came to the country, it is not just an indicator of linguistic ability. You want to ask all families about linguistic background. Don't make an assumption because of based on last name. There's 147 languages in this area, just in this area. And the children will have all kinds of varying exposure to those languages. So please ask everyone about it and don't make assumptions based on accent. The other piece I want to get to is in terms of assessment. I've done a lot of research in bilingual assessment, and there are all kinds of different kinds of questions we can ask. But some of the main ones that I want to highlight here is when were they first exposed? When did it happen? How did it happen? How are the languages being used? I'm not going to read through the whole set of questions. Also, when we assess bilingual children, there can be all kinds of errors that are conducted, and that's what's really driven some of my research in this area, is that many times people can take assessments and try to translate them on the fly. And we can certainly misdiagnose individuals and children who are bilingual with disorders in that way. So let's take an example real quick. One of the early questions that can come up on assessments of children learning a second language, it's a very easy question in English, one of the first ones. And you think about some of the first words that children learn. There might be a picture of a ball. And what is this? A ball. And it's really one of these first questions that sometimes come up on these assessments. And if you think about young ones, how excited they get about balls. Now say the word ball in Spanish, for those of you that are multilingual in Spanish. Pelota. Now say pelota, everybody. How likely do you think that's an early indicator of Spanish language proficiency for a young one? Do you think that on a well-developed Spanish measure and assessment that would be one of the first items to show a child? Because they actually say ota, they don't say pelota. So on-the-fly translations just don't do it. You might be pressured. I've been asked many times to take an English measure and translate it on the fly. It does not have any validity. We are completely missing the boat. Don't do it. And other things is that we can pick measures out of convenience, familiarity. Oh, it's good in English, so it must be well done in Spanish. Wrong. And looking at the wrong thing. I'm interested in autism versus language, and I'm picking the wrong thing. And assessing in only one language, where we're underestimating the abilities of a child. And even if you, let's say, don't speak a second language, there are ways that we can pull in individuals. And now a lot of assessments have a piece where you can use a translator. I have a disclosure. All this work ended up pushing me to write a book about this just to get it on the field, but I don't care. You can always ask me. You don't have to buy the book. Just ask me questions if you want, okay? You'll all have my email later, but it's just a disclosure. So in the book, we analyzed all kinds of techniques about what's the best way to assess bilingual children and did a very deep dive on the measures that are out there for bilingual kids in Spanish and in English. How well do they work in many different ways? And we found that over 1/3 of the measures for young children that are developed in Spanish are not good. And they include the most extensively ones used in practice and in research and in policy making. I pulled just 3 measures for us to take a quick look at. You don't have to go into this, and this is just a little bit of the data, but there's 3 measures here, the Battelle, the Immigrant, the Dial. And if you see black dots, it's kind of like Consumer Reports, it's good. If it's white, it's no good, okay? Bottom line. 2, great. They work well in English. I love the Battelle, and I love the Immigrant, really great in English. But they don't have any psychometric strengths in Spanish. They shouldn't be used. And I'll say that, just so you can clearly see. We did a very deep dive. The Dial has been developed thinking about what are the first words in English and Spanish that are well developed. Recently, one of the best moments of my career happened it's been a couple of years ago. Stood up from my table and was like, this is so cool. The federal government released a regulation that all bilingual children in Head Start and early Head Start programs, including tribal and migrant, have to be bilingually assessed. Before that, they could just be assessed in one language if they were bilingual. And then they cited the work that we've done. So I say that to you because the work that we do makes a difference, and people are listening and caring. And then National Academies of Science has provided some recommendations lately about improved bilingual assessment for bilingual children, and I'm happy to have contributed to that work. But finally, I want to kind of talk about, just quickly, about communication. We've been talking about families that have been separated and reunified. And about half of Hispanic families have experienced a familial separation. Half of Hispanic immigrant families. And we know that disruptions in family unit can lead to all kinds of outcomes psychologically, right? Both depression in children and the mother, loneliness, anxiety, PTSD, which was discussed before, weaker academic performance, family conflict. And as was discussed before, there are issues that happen upon reunification, which we're going to talk about now. Because people say, well, let's bring them back together, but then how do we get that to happen in a most positive way possible? My doctoral student and I developed an intervention called the CASA, which means home, culturally sensitive acculturation, separation, and reunification-related group interventions using CBT methodology, or techniques, in a manualized form for children in schools There are some family-based interventions that were talked about, but there are very few that are really for children when they're in schools, and we conducted this research in the local school systems to be provided during the school day, and also pulling in the parents at the end. And pulling here, you'll see some of the content that was reviewed: mindfulness, acceptance-based practices, CBT, talking about ambiguous loss, attachment, acculturation, etc. The final two sessions, the 7th session was with the parents specifically, only with the parents, and the 8th one was with everyone together. I'm going to give, again, some highlights. This is preliminary. We just did our first trial, a randomized control trial, though, where we did have a waitlist control and a 17. We found statistically significant reduction in children's depression, the effect size of 0.27, and promising findings in children's anxiety of effect size 0.38. Also, stronger communication with the family, with the biological parent. So talking about language and communication, the stronger they were communicating with their bio parent, the less likely that child is going to have depression. We hadn't talked about grandma, who we left behind. Then she died on me, so I was like, oh gosh, earlier. They had, many of them, if they came and separated, they were separated. These children in this study are separated by more than a year, many of them 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 years from their families. Their attachment to their surrogate caregiver, usually grandparent or aunt or uncle, the stronger trust they had to the adult they left behind, the more anxiety they were feeling here because of the separation. And the more alienated they felt, that they couldn't talk to them, they couldn't call them, the higher level of trauma it was to them. So breaking communication, you know, can relate to negative mental health difficulties. So along all lines, we want to have strength in communication with the parents here, along the way, and with those that have kind of bolstered them to come here. I'm going to skip some of these. We did qualitative analysis to hear from the children, to understand what the recommendations are for the intervention, to understand its benefits, and some of it's actually recommendations for improvement. I'm going to go to the child quotes in the interest of time and hear from the children themselves, because bilingualism, communication, language, the end goal is to hear each other. So let's hear, we saw some of the research, let's hear from the children. And this is related to the intervention. I liked what we did to calm down, to relax, learning how to breathe, to calm down when I'm upset or sad. When I would attend the group on Mondays, I was always upset because of things that happened over the weekend at home, and the group helped calm me. I learned how to overcome, that there is no need to fight or argue. It, which is the group, helped me resolve things differently. It was harder to talk about people in my country because I miss them. They aren't with me, and I want to be with them. After talking about it, I feel a bit better. Now, I'd like to talk more about what we feel. I always like to talk about some of the negatives, too. So let's hear some of the negatives of what children said about talking about reunification and going through the treatment. Sometimes I would start to feel bored, like sluggish. And it's interesting across all three of our presentations, children talking about being bored. So we need to kind of reconnect, you know, connect with them. It's very interesting. Like sluggish. I think it's a different way of being, too, in this country than in the home country, what children are doing every day and how we connect with them. I've had many thoughts in my head, and it would be hard to sit still. One time, someone said something that made me feel bad because it reminded me of something that happened in my family. It's been hard for me to get used to living in this country. I would have liked to learn more or talk about how to get used to living with a stepfather, which is another theme, across different samples, which is interesting. And we also talked to the parents, heard their voices, examined their words analytically, all kinds of analytics that went into it. I'm going to move forward to some quotes in the interest of time. Parents said, we were in session talking about our experiences, the things that have happened to us, remembering what we lived. I started to recall those things that have happened and that I've forgotten, like what we've, like a family, been through together. How I wanted something to happen, which is moving here, and then it did. And you don't even realize when it's happened, like the family's reunifying. Because what we discussed in this group was true, it hurts to leave your family, and that's the pure reality. And we'll end on this quote. anything that could help us help them, which meaning the children. So anything that could help us parents help them, like when they feel sad or when they say things are not going well for them. Sometimes, like other people, tell them, what are you doing in this country? You don't belong here. And we need to let them know that they do matter. I'm acknowledging a whole bunch of people that are involved in all kinds of research that I do across the country and internationally. There are children, community partners, my students that sometimes run through children's research partners and funders. And if we can answer some questions, we have a little bit of time, questions now, and then you can always contact me via email. Email is honestly the best because often sitting in an office and running around in the community, okay? So just email me. Thank you.
Questions?
And oh, thank you. Is this on? Oh, yes. Okay. I was curious about, you know, if a parent came into your office and was wondering, you know, sort of like all this beautiful information you share with us, you know, about expectations for how long it should take a child to develop mastery of a certain language, and a parent-child finds his or herself getting really impatient with the child. You know, what are some things to keep in mind, you know, as they're continuing to try to, you know, help the child develop their language?
The number one thing I say to parents and I say to professionals, clinicians out there, and to researchers too, is to listen to the parent and listen to the gut of a parent. If a parent is truly concerned about the linguistic development, and I start asking them, well, how are they doing in their first language? And they're like, well, they've been struggling for a long time even when they're little, that means that there's something wrong. I would say 95% of the time, a parent has their pulse to what's happening. So some of the kind of big Travis issues that I've seen happen is when parents don't listen to their gut, and professionals say it's going to take a while, but they're not thinking about the broader cognitive piece or the broader linguistic piece, that they should be developing language in some domain, in some area. They should not be completely plateauing. It's very unlikely to plateau. And if that occurs, a clinical referral is needed. So I always tell a parent, and they're talking to me, I don't shoo-shoo it. I say, listen to your gut. Are they developing linguistically in some way, educationally in some way? Or have you been concerned about this for a while? And empower the parent to reach out to someone if the concerns continue. Like give them a marker. Well, this is a yellow flag or a red flag. Like a month from now, if this is still happening. Sometimes professionals talk about something called a silent period where kids don't talk in either language. And that can take, sometimes it'll last maybe 2 months, but it shouldn't last more than that. But honestly, as clinicians, listen to the parent.
On language, because I've always kind of wondered this. So is there a period of time in the beginning where people are actually translating, like when they're translating in their head and then are saying it, and then how long does that period tend to be when it becomes, when they stop translating and they're actually listening to that and able to respond in that to the language as
I would say, I mean, bottom line across all processes, at least 6 months. So it can continue on for years and years afterwards, depending on how infrequent a word might come up. But actively translating almost sentence to sentence, word to word, definitely the first 6 months. And then it becomes more fluid in terms of understanding, becomes a much more automated process, and they're developing their linguistic processes in that second language. Thinking about how they want to say something, and children will just like take a little while and then say something that'll be a year to 2 years. And there's variation, of course. Yeah.
I actually have 2 questions. Sure. In mental health settings, when we use screening assessments and screening tools, some of the most common ones we use are translated and validated in Spanish, but a lot of the less common ones aren't. For example, last week, a couple of our colleagues were looking for something, a self-esteem measurement scale, and it exists in English, but it didn't exist in Spanish. And so we were trying to figure out what's better, not administering at all or translating it on the fly using our own rough translations of English to Spanish. And I was wondering if you had any
kind of guidance for us as clinicians of kind of doing a provider translation of a.
Yeah. And I do this also for, like, I'm leading a national study, like, decide, like, you know, at what point do we say we're going to translate it no matter what, knowing that we're not going to capture everything that someone is experiencing. I do think there's some self-esteem measures, though, in Spanish, so we can chat afterwards.
Yeah, those would be great.
Happy to talk about that. I would say that if it's more for understanding in a general conversation, understand where a family is at, if you do a quick translation, it's better than nothing. I mean, families tell me, I'm so glad you just asked me. Like, fathers, immigrant fathers are often actually not asked if they're depressed. And if you ask them, they're like, thank gosh you asked, because there's this, like, perception of them. So I would say do that clinically. If you're using it for diagnostic purposes, don't do it at all.
And my second question is a larger question, but could you speak briefly to maybe differences in language development for children who their native language also has a different alphabet? And I'm thinking of kids in DC who are Amharic speaking or Mandarin speaking. You know, what should we be considering?
Yeah, so an explicit instruction is important. So sometimes people think of everything happening kind of implicitly, like they'll learn it, they're sponges. Even for individuals whose languages are closer to English than further away, like some languages that are written in different form, explicit instruction is important. And so for those children that have even a more wider gap to kind of conquer, they'll need to learn two very different systems. And so very explicit instruction is necessary. And people make assumptions like, oh, math should be easy for everyone because it's a universal language. It is not. It is not. In the way that we write numerals, in the way that we put straight down or across, there's so much that needs to be explicitly taught. And that's where some of the frustration with parents at homework time can happen. Yeah. Even in English, if you speak the same language, right? So the parents in there are like, huh? I don't understand this. Yeah.
One question.
Okay.
Let me see which one I ask first. No, I'm thinking more in sort of the clinical setting, like in the therapeutic setting. And I've asked this question before, and I just want to know your answer. How important it is that therapy is conducted in the native language?
There's some science showing that it's best if provided in the first language because they're more able to express themselves fully. However, if it can't, it can't, and it's better than nothing.
And I've seen some groups that I run where I have people who are multilingual in the group that when the language gets really emotional, they do switch. And the important is to be able for somebody to hear what's being said.
Yeah.
And my other question was, you were talking about language-based disabilities a little bit. You touched upon that. And I've definitely see it here in DC where the interventions for, say, like dyslexia, for example, are much more evolved in the English language. And so if you have a child who's dyslexic, what I've seen is that they are often, and some of my clients at least, they often discourage them from continuing the second language. And I wanted you to comment on that.
Right. Science is clear not to discontinue the first language. So don't do that. But you can provide intervention in the second language and it will work. So just like psychotherapy intervention will work in the second language, although maybe not to the same extent, the disability, dyslexia interventions and language disorders for anyone, I don't know if we have many SLTs today, will work in the second language. It will transfer, because remember what we talked about, that similar indicators of disability will be present across the two languages. So you are intervening across the two. So they will be what's called cross-language transfer.
We're actually going to open up the floor for questions for all speakers, so if you have any, but I think we have a question.
I work with a number of families who, the parents are monolingual, predominantly Spanish speaking, and their children are young, under kindergarten age, and in an effort to help their children acculturate and assimilate, really are doing everything in their power to help them learn English. But a lot of that means they're doing very passive things, like instead of reading or talking to them in their native language, they're putting them in front of the TV or a screen in English. Do you have any tips on how to talk to and help parents understand the value and the importance of developing a foundation in the family's native language, so not only to develop that language, but also to develop English skills?
And I would say the majority of immigrant families think that and do that. And I would say the majority of professionals think that the only way to learn English is by speaking English. But we know that the faster process is to develop linguistic processes in general. So when I explain this to parents, I let them know, when you're not providing language, you're not talking with your child, you're not asking them to speak back with you, you're truncating their ability to understand language across anything, English or Spanish. So then I have them understand it more from a brain-based perspective, and that encouraging language, having vocabulary developed, having grammar developed, having a back and forth, and the reason for language will help them bounce to English even faster. And then they understand that. And also I have them think about long-term, some of the things that they've seen in other families that they don't want to have happen in theirs, where the children are not able to speak the language of the parent is not able to speak the language of the child, for lots of varied reasons that we talked about today. And then the strong bond of a family is not there as strong as it could be, and some of the things that they've seen happen to those children. And so they understand it from that perspective, and that is not, the science shows that is not harmful and actually is helpful, so that they understand the world and how language is actually used. And then they'll get it, usually.
Maybe one last question for any of the speakers. All right. Oh, yes.
Not a question. I just wanted to thank you all for some really great presentations today, and acknowledge the committee for good work in putting this together. For those of you interested in the plight of immigrant children, there's going to be a march on June 30th, and you can find out more about it on moveon.org. moveon.org.
All right, so thank you so much to our speakers. Thank you so much to Dr. Enchautegui-de-Jesúsr, Ida, Rachel, and Dr. Barreuco for speaking to us, by sharing their knowledge, their research. This is absolutely amazing, and I hope you guys had a wonderful time as much as I did, and I think it was very informative, again, very relevant for the times. So again, quick housekeeping things. Please fill out the evaluation forms. Even if you're not seeking CEs, we would really appreciate the feedback, and turn them in at the end. Nurses, however, if you're seeking CNEs for nursing education, please bring the evaluation forms to me, because I have the certificates here, and I'll gather the evaluation forms. If you did not sign in, even if you're, again, even if you're not seeking Cs, please do sign in. We would really appreciate that. Thank you. And we'll send out slides, and we'll send out other information through email. Thank you so much for attending. We really appreciate it.